In 1937, a book hit the shelves called The First Rebel by Neil H. Swanson. Swanson was a well-known author of historic novels in the 1930s and the 1940s, where his books were read by many people who found the frontier life and the Wild West truly entertaining genres. It was this public interest in these subjects that spawned the Western craze of the 40s and the 50s in America. Swanson's book, however, was not about the simpler times of gunfights and bad guys in the lawless towns of the great American West, but about a man who was captured by Indians, lived with them, and came back to his former life and used his new knowledge of Indian culture to protect the people on his frontier from these Indian raiders. It is a neat little story, but it turned out to not be a story at all. Though Swanson wrote his book in an entertaining way, so it read like a novel, the story of this young man was very much true. Historical records and the boy's own first-hand account of his experiences were well recorded in the historical record. But the last part of the novel explains a series of events that were so outlandish to be true, as this boy-turned-man led a group of armed civilians in an uprising against British soldiers in 1765, a whole 10 years before the beginning of the American Revolution in Lexington, Massachusetts. The action in the story was so riveting that Hollywood made it into a movie in 1939 called Allegheny Uprising, starring none other than John Wayne as this young man, and loosely based on the actual story. The story was so captivating, it had to be made up, like so many of those Western books and movies. There is no way any of this could have happened, or did it? In the back of each copy of Swanson's book was an appendix that contained letters and court depositions that described everything in this storyline. These letters and depositions were from various characters in the book, including the young boy, James Smith, his brother-in-law, William Smith, Esquire, Lieutenant Charles Grant of Fort Loudoun and commander of Black Watch, Pennsylvania Governor John Penn, and British General Thomas Gage. All real people in history. The letters were all written in an older dialect dating back to the 1700s, suggesting that they were actual letters and depositions written by these people. But Swanson gave no sources on where he found these documents. It turns out that almost all of these letters in the back of this book are found in the Colonial Records of Pennsylvania, Volume 9, proving that these letters are real and the events that they describe did indeed happen. Though Swanson's first Rebel book and his movie disappeared in importance over time, Swanson's efforts preserved a piece of history that was long forgotten. A true story about a group of citizens who stood up for their rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, 11 years before Thomas Jefferson wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence. A group of citizens that stood up for the civil law and decentralization of government and denounced tyrannical behavior of the British military. A group of citizens who were located on one of the most remote places of the British Empire, but yet were reported on by London newspapers and discussed by Ben Franklin and King George III himself. Join me as I explore the stories and locations of this lost but important event in history in the area around Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, that helped contribute to the creation of the United States of America. This is the true story of the Black Boy Rebellion. James Smith, son of a Scotch-Irish immigrant, at the age of 18 was captured by Indians on July the 1st, 1755, while working on a Pennsylvania military road being built west from Fort McDowell, located in the Conagajig settlement near what is now Marks, Pennsylvania today. This military road was to support the efforts of British General Edward Braddock as he assaulted the French Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio in modern-day Pittsburgh today. James was taken to Fort Duquesne and was nearly beaten to death in the Indian ritual called the running of the gauntlet. After James recovered from his wounds, he was adopted by the Conewago tribe, a tribe of Mohawk Indians living in modern-day Ohio. He lived with his Conewago brethren for 5 years, learning their culture, languages, and mode of warfare. James then escaped his Indian captors in Canada and boarded a French prisoner ship of English prisoners in hopes he would be taken to England for prisoner exchange as the 7 Years' War between England and France raged on around the world. Instead, he was kept in prison for 4 months in French-controlled Montreal until he was taken to Fort Crown Point along Lake Champlain along the modern New York state border and exchanged as a prisoner, freeing him to go back home to the Conagajig settlement sometime in late 1760. So behind me here, you will see Mount Parnell. And then just below that, there's a farm in the distance here. And in and around that farm somewhere, down towards the creek, is where James Smith would have settled when he returned from his Indian captivity. I am currently standing on what is called Mountain View, which is very close to the Mountain View Elementary School. I'm actually standing in the backyard of a fellow that was gracious enough to let me stand here and tell this story. But James Smith would have settled somewhere in and around here, most likely somewhere down towards where that farm is behind me. Now in May 1763, James married Ann Wilson of Peters Township after years of adjusting back to life among the Europeans after spending so many years living as a Native American. Up until 1763, Indian attacks on the frontier had died down after the British finally took Fort Duquesne in 1758, causing the Indians to make peace with the British. But 1763 brought new trouble in the form of Pontiac's War, in which Chief Pontiac united the many Indian tribes to attack frontier outposts and settlers along the frontier. Because of the Quaker government of Pennsylvania's policy of non-violence against the natives attacking the frontier, the settlers of the Conagajig settlement raised money to pay a group of riflemen for several months to help fend off Indian attacks. The committee in charge of this community action appointed James Smith as captain of this company of men, since he knew so much about the Indians and their tactics of war. Smith conscripted 2 young men as his lieutenants, who were also at one time Indian captives. They worked to train a ranger group in the art of Native American warfare, with skills such as tracking, camouflage, evasion, sneak attacks, and other guerrilla warfare techniques. These rangers were able to successfully deter Indian attacks in their settlement. Along with using Indian tactics, Smith dressed his men in Indian style, with breechclouts, leggings, moccasins, and shrouds. To help identify them from their enemy, they were dressed in green shrouds and red bandanas around their heads. The signature style of these rangers became their painted faces, as they wore native war paint of black and red for camouflage and scare tactics. For this style, this ranger group became known as the Black Boys. The Black Boys' method of lighting fires on the mountains and making a few men seem like 1,000, along with the skills that they acquired, proved effective. Their focus was deterring Indian attacks by tricking the native war parties into thinking that their numbers were greater than the native attackers. With too few warriors and a dwindling population, Native American forces would only attack if they knew that they had an advantage. And with his background while living with Indians for 5 years, James Smith understood how they thought. The money ran out from the local settlers to fund this ranger group, and they petitioned the Pennsylvania government to pick up the cost of their defense. Despite the Black Boys' success, the government refused to lend the aid needed to keep the Black Boys in operation. With the lack of money to properly pay the Black Boys, the ranger group ceased their patrols and dispersed back to their former lives as farmers and tradesmen. Without the Black Boys as a deterrent, the Indians were once again bold enough to carry out their attacks on the Conococheague settlement. Captain James Smith then joined for a short time the British forces to combat the Native Americans in the West. He then joined the Bouquet expedition into the Ohio in 1764 after the notorious Indian attack on the schoolhouse near modern-day Greencastle today that resulted in the deaths of the schoolmaster, Enoch Brown, and 10 of his pupils. With the help of James Smith's knowledge of the Ohio from his captivity experience, his ability to act as an interpreter, and his skills in Indian warfare, the expedition was a success that ended Pontiac's war and started the peace process with the Ohio Indians. The governor of the province of Pennsylvania signed a decree making trade illegal with the Indians until a peace was officially declared. After his war experience, James Smith returned home with the rank of lieutenant. James settled down back home with his wife and child to be a farmer, thinking that the Indian wars were over and his service was no longer needed. William Smith was a cousin and brother-in-law to James Smith. Even though William was not much older than his cousin James, when James's father passed away, William became one of the caretakers of James and his siblings. William was in charge of their well-being and education. In 1748, after William moved to the Conococheague settlement with his charges, he became a lieutenant in the local militia regiment. At some point, William married Mary Smith, who is James's sister, making him not only James's cousin, but also his brother-in-law. In 1755, William was one of 5 road commissioners that was in charge of building the supply road through Pennsylvania to assist with Braddock's army that was supposed to assault Fort Duquesne. William asked James to help as part of the road crew to help cut the road through the wilderness. While working on this road is when James was captured by Indians. In 1757, William became a Justice of the Peace of Cumberland County, which consisted of modern-day Franklin and Cumberland counties in Pennsylvania today, serving as judge, jailer, and policeman within the county. He was the representative of the law in his jurisdiction. In 1759, William Smith purchased from James Black a trading post and mill next to a small run that is now known as Johnson's Run. The town that was once known as Blackstown, or Black's Trading Post, became known as Squire Smith's Town. William added to his ground a home built with a basement designed like a jail to serve his needs as a justice of the peace, and the town grew in size. Eventually, William's son laid out the town in 1786 and renamed it Mercersburg, and it is currently Mercersburg, Pennsylvania today. The house that William Smith built would have sat, at least traditionally known, here on this piece of property right next to the MMP&W Fire Department. It is a vacant lot now, but the house used to sit here up until about 2011 when it was torn down. A son of a proud Scotsman, Charles Grant followed his family legacy of being a soldier by volunteering his services to the British Crown by joining the 77th Regiment of Foot, otherwise known as the Montgomery Scottish Highlanders. At age 18, Charles Grant served under the command of a relative named Major James Grant, who was ordered to scout ahead of the main force under General Forbes and spy on the French that held Fort Duquesne in 1758. Charles was caught in the fray when his commander decided to attempt to take the fort, and as the Scotsmen descended towards the fort wearing kilts and blowing on bagpipes, they were slaughtered by the French and Indian forces, resulting in Charles being captured by Native Americans. After being released in 1760 by his Indian captors, Charles Grant rejoined the army to see action in the Canadian campaign and then fought in the Caribbean. In 1764, Grant then served in the Bouquet expedition into the Ohio to end Pontiac's War. In this campaign, he was part of the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, also known as Black Watch. He served alongside James Smith in this expedition. Soon afterwards, Grant was promoted to lieutenant and became commandant of Fort Loudoun in the Conococheague settlement in present-day Fort Loudoun, Pennsylvania, and not far from Squire Smith's town. And this is Fort Loudoun that he was the commander of. Grant's Black Watch was to provide protection in case of Indian attack and maintain their section of the wagon road that led to Fort Pitt in western Pennsylvania. One of Grant's Scottish Highlanders was Sergeant Leonard McGlasson, who was a tough and no-holds-barred man. In 1763, Chief Pontiac united the Indian tribes together to attack white settlers that continued to settle on Indian land, starting what is known as Pontiac's War. This resulted in the British losing several forts and having others fall under attack by Indian war parties. In response, British Colonel Henry Bouquet led a force from Carlisle, Pennsylvania into western Pennsylvania to relieve a siege on Fort Pitt, clashing with Indian forces at the Battle of Bushy Run on August the 5th and 6th of 1763. By using Indian battle tactics, Bouquet's force defeated the native forces and relieved Fort Pitt, breaking the siege. This is the first time a British force successfully defeated a native force in a large battle. The defeat only angered the natives even more, resulting in raiding parties attacking settlers on the frontier in the spring and the summer of 1764, resulting in the capture and brutal murder of many settlers. Because of the war and the attacks on the frontier, the governor of Pennsylvania issued a decree saying that no trade with the Indians was allowed to occur until peace was officially brokered with the natives. This includes items such as metal scalping knives and metal tomahawks and guns, lead and gunpowder, all items that could be used to kill the frontier inhabitants of Pennsylvania. As discussed before, the people of the Conococheague settlement paid for and organized a group of rangers called the Black Boys under the command of James Smith to defend the settlement from Indian attacks. In late 1764, Colonel Henry Bouquet organized an expedition into the Ohio region to force a peace with the hostile Indian tribes centered out there, which essentially ended Pontiac's War. Again, this is the expedition that James Smith and Charles Grant both participated in. Militarily, Bouquet was able to force peace with the Indians by December of 1764. But to further cement this peace into something long-term and lasting, the British needed to come up with a plan to appease their disgruntled neighbors to the west. This is when they called on the services of a Mr. George Croghan. Native Americans at the time believed that the most important way to restore trust was through the act of ceremonial gift-giving when treaties were being signed. According to Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, if we conquer their prejudices by our generosity, they will lay aside their jealousies, and we may rest in security. This is much cheaper than any other plan and more certain of success. One of the British deputy superintendents of Indian affairs was given the job of cementing this peace in December of 1764. This man was Mr. George Croghan. Now, George Croghan was a man of dubious intentions and well known for it. He was described as rogue, dishonest, always suspect, wild, and a player. An Irishman by birth, Croghan came to the New World around 1741 and immediately began trading furs and goods with Indians. He learned their languages and their needs and their wants. With political connections and close contacts with powerful business merchants in Philadelphia, Croghan became a wealthy man, trading goods to Indians, making deals for the Pennsylvania government, and collecting land, and lots of it too. By 1773, Croghan laid claim to 1.5 million acres in western Pennsylvania, being the only European man allowed to own land in Indian territory. Croghan was so well connected and known. His house was listed on a map of Pennsylvania to show his location in Cumberland County. He may have been well connected and known, but he wasn't well respected. Edward Shippen, mayor of Philadelphia, said, "As a private person, I have no reason to say anything in favor of Mr. Croghan, but this I am pretty sure of, that if he could not bring in the Indians for a conference, no man on the continent could do it." A 1761 letter from William Potts at Fort Pitt accuses Croghan of making the mothers and grandmothers of the young women at a party so drunk that they forgot their jobs of protecting the chastity of their daughters, in which Croghan took full advantage of the situation. Croghan may have helped negotiate with Indians and put up money for forts to defend the frontier, but he was also a ruthless man, out to line his pockets with as much money as possible and take what he wanted, no matter who got hurt in the process. Croghan's plan was to launch one of the largest gift-giving ceremonies ever done with the Indians. He was going to make a treaty at Fort Pitt and then travel down the Ohio River to remote Indian villages and give gifts along the way. By the end, he hoped to find Pontiac himself and give gifts to finally end the war the war chief started. But as with everything with Croghan, it had to benefit himself also. Croghan was given 2,000 pounds, the British currency at the time, from General Thomas Gage, who was the Commander-in-Chief of British Armed Forces in North America, to purchase the goods necessary for trade. But what Croghan did not tell General Gage was that he had a side deal where he was going to make 25% of the profits on. In November, before Croghan was given this duty by the British military, he made a deal with a long-standing mercantile firm in Philadelphia called Brighton, Wharton and Morgan, along with two trading partners, Robert Field and Robert Collender, to transport and provide 20,000 pounds of trade goods to the Western Indians. This was to make them the first available British traders to the natives once the war was over and trade was reopened after peace was established. Croghan felt that the 2,000 pounds allotted to him from the British government was not enough for his endeavor, so he combined his duties of diplomat for the British government with military money with his duties as a trader for his business partners, and combined the shipment into one large shipment. In January 1765, the goods were being gathered as Brighton, Morgan, and Morgan was having trouble finding enough goods to fill Croghan's order for the trade mission. The shipment included 5,700 shirts, enough to clothe more than half of the total male population of Indians in Ohio at the time. 1 ton of sugar, 1,800 gallons of rum, and bales of cloth, along with gunpowder and other goods. The shipment weighed around 44 tons and was worth anywhere between 20 to 30,000 pounds of British currency. Croghan was given a pass to move these goods to Fort Pitt by the area military commander, which was Colonel Henry Bouquet. Remember, Pennsylvania had a decree at this time that there was to be no trade with the Indians until official peace was reached with them. But during wartime, high-ranking military officials such as Gage and Bouquet could provide a pass for diplomatic or military purposes to move these goods. The problem is, Croghan was carrying way more goods than what Gage authorized, and a large majority of these goods were private, but traveling mistakenly under a military pass. As the winter of early 1765 dumped heavy snow over Pennsylvania, Croghan decided to leave Philadelphia to travel with only a light load of goods across Pennsylvania to Fort Pitt, entrusting his business partner, Captain Robert Callender, to transport the rest when the roads became clearer. On February the 28th, 1765, after a difficult journey on the snow-covered military roads, Croghan arrived at Fort Pitt. He now was waiting at the fort for the arrival of Callender and the remainder of the illegal trade goods traveling under a military pass, along with the king's goods that was bought for negotiating purposes. What Callender didn't realize was that the locals of the Conacajig settlement in Cumberland County were becoming suspicious of Croghan's plans, a suspicion that would result in Croghan's scheme literally going up in smoke. Captain Robert Callender moved by wagon the rest of these goods to a compound 10 miles outside of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, most likely in Pennsboro, either on Callender's personal property or Croghan's personal property. He then moved part of this shipment via wagon to John Howe's house, which was known as Pauling's Tavern, and that's just south of Greencastle, Pennsylvania today, near the intersection of Williamsport Pike and Minor Road, which is right here. And Pauling's Tavern would have set somewhere in this vicinity, not sure where. There's a nice way sign right here marking the location of Pauling's Tavern and its historical significance, not only in this story but also in the French and Indian War as well. Now, this move to Pauling's was taken as suspicious by the local inhabitants of this frontier settlement at Conacajig, because by going here to Pauling's, Callender bypassed the official military road that was called Forbes Road that went by Fort Loudoun, which is the British military installation within this settlement. If this shipment was indeed the king's goods for military or diplomatic purposes and truly fell outside the Pennsylvania governor's no trade with the Indian law, why didn't Callender take the wagons to Fort Loudoun, where they could be inspected and protected by Lieutenant Charles Grant and Black Watch that was garrisoned there? Well, it was most likely because he knew that the majority of the cargo he hauled was not military in nature and was illegally transported under a military pass. Callender understood that that would be the end of his trip, so he most likely brought him down here to Pauling's Tavern and loaded him on pack horses here, and just to bypass the whole British imperial system. Callender understood that westward from the Conacajig settlement, the roads were not able to support the wagons that he used to get the goods from Philadelphia to modern south central Pennsylvania today, or to this location. The roads from Pauling's Tavern to Fort Pitt, which is in modern day Pittsburgh today, were truly very bad and would have destroyed wagons extremely quickly. So Callender decided to hire people to lead pack horse trains over the rough and steep Appalachian Mountains. The goods were unloaded from the wagons and strapped onto wooden frames that sat on the back of a horse. That horse then had the maneuverability to walk up steep and rocky terrain, an advantage that a wagon did not have. Kind of like a four-wheel drive of the 18th century. Now, William Duffield, a Welsh-run man, was a patron here at Pauling's Tavern, while Callender was building his pack horse train and was observing the horses being loaded with goods. While watching the teamsters load the pack horses, William Duffield watched as the head came loose from one of the barrels, and he saw the contents of the barrel spill out, and it was a barrel full of knives. Now, Duffield, being a resident of the Conacajig settlement, which was heavily attacked by native war parties, called them scalping knives, figuring that the knives were going to be traded to the Indians and be used for the purpose of scalping their victims in possible future attacks in this settlement. William Duffield left Pauling's Tavern and went to spread the word of the illegal trade goods that he just saw. On May 5, 1765, 2 pack-horse trains departed from Pauling's Tavern and headed west towards Squire Smithstown on the Valley Road. Robert Allison, resident of Antrim Township and member of the founding family of Greencastle, Pennsylvania, led drivers in a train of 32 pack horses. Elias Davison, also of Cumberland County, led a train of 49 pack horses. This is a total of 81 horses, which would have hauled a little less than 10 tons of goods, about a quarter of the total amount of goods Croghan was planning on shipping to Fort Pitt for trade and gift-giving. As the pack horse trains traveled the Valley Road towards Squire Smithstown, they stopped along the road at William Maxwell's house. This house was located along Montgomery Church Road today. And as you can see, I am here on Montgomery Church Road, and the land behind me here, in the area where this house is behind me, would have been William Maxwell's property, and would have been where this pack train stopped. Now, the Maxwell family, including William's son, Justice James Maxwell, were friends to Robert Collender and took the side of the traders in this dispute. At William Maxwell's here, a group of local men met the pack horse train. Some of the men identified in this group were William Porter, John Porter, Reese Porter, John Young, William Nesbitt, James Robinson, Robert McCoy, William Dean, William McFerrin, Patrick Hart, and several others. It was Reese Porter and Patrick Hart that told the horse drivers that they intended to stop the goods, and then the party of men left on foot on the road west towards Squire Smithstown. The pack horse trains then advanced on to Squire Smithstown, which would be going that way on this road, passing the party of local men on the way. It became obvious to the drivers that the word got out further, for when the pack horses reached Squire Smithstown in front of Justice William Smith's house or in front of James Cunningham's tavern, depending on who was giving the deposition, they were greeted by more men protesting the advance of the pack horse train. Now, Justice William Smith's house in Squire Smithstown would have sat just up the road from where I'm standing. But there is a possibility that this this confrontation actually occurred in front of James Cunningham's tavern. James Cunningham's tavern would have stood somewhere where this Liberty Station is today in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. So that is why I am standing in this spot in front of a gas station telling a history story. But this group of men grew to about 50 men, which eventually included the men who met the pack horse train at William Maxwell's. Some of the new men to join the party was identified as Henry Anderson, William Thyler, John McMahon, Samuel Owings, a man named Campbell, William Morrison, David Bowen, James Rankin, and 3 men from Maryland named Russ Price, William Price, and Christy Haggard. William Porter, Samuel Owings, William Nesbitt, and several others approached a pack horse driver in this vicinity here in Mercersburg, modern Mercersburg, and threatened to blow his brains out if they did not stop the train. William Price, who was a Marylander, said he had 10 men from Maryland with him that were determined to destroy the ammunition that the pack horse train was carrying. Justice William Smith, who heard all the commotion from inside of his house up the road here, arrived on the scene here somewhere near this spot, according to his own sworn testimony, and addressed the crowd, saying that stopping or harming the drivers or goods would be illegal. Now the crowd still jeered the pack horse drivers and fired their guns in the air right here in the middle of what's in the town of Mercersburg. Some of the crowd voiced their opinions to Justice William Smith, in which they said because peace was not made yet with the Indians, It is wrong for their enemies that killed so many settlers and captured so many of their children to be furnished with ammunition to use against the settlers on the frontier. They felt that the goods on these pack horse trains were private goods of merchants in Philadelphia who were sending these goods west to trade with the Indians, which is against the current provincial law of Pennsylvania that prohibited trade until peace was declared. Elias Davison, leader of one of the pack horse trains, presented a pass signed by George Croghan, which said the goods had Colonel Bouquet's permission to go to Fort Pitt for military purposes, showing that these were indeed the king's goods. The crowd was skeptical, however, because it was the governor of Pennsylvania that ceased trade, and there was no seal on the pass by Governor John Penn. Justice William Smith was familiar with Croghan's signature, but was skeptical of the one that was on the pass provided by Davison. The crowd and Justice Smith persuaded Davison to go with William Morrison, David Bowen, and James Rankin to travel to Fort Loudoun so Lieutenant Charles Grant, the commanding officer of the fort, could attest to the validity of the pass. While Davison went to Fort Loudoun to verify the authenticity of the pass, Allison led both pack horse trains west towards Larrabee's Gap, going that way, known now today as the Cove Gap, along the road that is now known as Route 16 or Buchanan Trail West. Now, before Allison left the pack trains, the crowd of Pennsylvanians and Marylanders warned them by saying that they believed that the Virginians might stop them. As Allison began to ascend the North Mountain at Larrabee's Gap, just west of Squire Smith's town, Morrison, Bowen, and Rankin returned to William Smith. They said that Davison presented his pass to Lieutenant Grant at Fort Loudoun, in which Grant confirmed that he received orders from Colonel Henry Bouquet to expect trade goods that were to pass by the Conocajig settlement, but Grant refused to sign the pass because he did not personally inspect the cargo that was already on its way over the mountain to the Great Cove, which is modern-day Fulton County, Pennsylvania. Grant then scolded Davison for not bringing the cargo to Fort Loudoun in the first place, so it could be inspected and gone through the proper channels. Though still skeptical of the cargo being hauled because of the scalping knives that William Duffield saw, and because of the shady way the pack train avoided Fort Loudoun's inspection, the three local frontiersmen said they were satisfied with Grant's answer and recommended to Justice Smith to let the pack horse trains continue on their journey. But some locals were still not satisfied with what they heard, and some followed the pack horse train into the Great Cove to get to the bottom of what was truly in the cargo. As the night grew darker, Robert Collender arrives near Fort Loudoun along the Forbes Road, the military road running west to Fort Pitt, and stored his cargo at two local farms for the night. Meanwhile, Davison catches up with his pack train led by Allison, and he catches up to him at McConnell's Tavern in the Great Cove, which is what is now known as McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania today, which is located in Fulton County, Pennsylvania. Now behind me, you see this log structure behind me here, that is most likely the McConnell's Tavern building. They're not sure if this was built later or not, but that was most likely McConnell's Tavern in which the pack train stopped at. As the pack horses were unloaded for the night, Davison, Allison, and the drivers were approached by 30 to 40 men who demanded to inspect the cargo. The group included men from the armed group at Squire Smith's town, such as Henry Anderson, William Porter, Reese Porter, and Samuel Owings, but also included newcomers like Thomas Orbison and a man named Smith, who most likely was James Smith, William Smith's brother-in-law. Duffield urged Davison and Allison to store up the goods here at McConnell's Tavern and proceed no further because of their improper proceedings. He said that the frontier people were worried of more Indian attacks in the future and feared that if trade goods reached the Indians in the West before a peace was reached, that those goods would be used to murder more innocent lives on the frontier as before. Thomas Orbison told Allison that he believed they were carrying gunpowder that could supply war material to the Indians that the British were technically at war with, still. Now, according to James Smith, the traders made fun of the concerned frontiersmen, and after the traders refused to store the cargo at McConnell's Tavern, the frontiersmen rummaged through some of the goods and then they left. At dawn, March 6, 1765, William Duffield, Thomas Orbison, and Henry Anderson returned to the traders' camp here around McConnell's Tavern and asked Robert Allison once again to allow them to inspect the goods, in which Allison showed them an invoice and refused to let them see the goods. Upon looking at the invoice, the men left, but they left with a similar warning as before. The Virginians would stop them at the foot of Sidling Hill. In the morning of March 6, 1765, a large amount of men that were harassing the pack horse train drivers the night before returned to Squire Smithstown. Elias Davison also returned to Smithstown as well, for a reason that's kind of lost to history. Robert Allison had the horses reloaded with the questionable cargo and continued west along the trail towards Fort Pitt. Allison was riding at the rear of the pack horse train. Justice William Smith was in Squire Smithstown, most likely at his house or possibly Cunningham's Tavern. Now, Robert Collender was with another pack horse train that was located near Fort Loudoun, but he was avoiding Lieutenant Grant and his Scottish Highland Regiment, called Blackwatch, which was occupying the fort at the time. George Croghan, now he was still at Fort Pitt, waiting for his precious goods to reach him so he could start his diplomatic mission. James Smith, however, who shared the opinions of his fellow frontiersmen at the Conococheague settlement, was designing a plan to stop the goods from reaching the west and arming the natives who had a long history of killing frontier families in the Great Cove, which is what's behind me here, and James's settlement, which is on the other side of those mountains, which would be the Conococheague settlement. James Smith gathered up about 10 of his men, who he trained in the warfare techniques of the Native Americans during Pontiac's War, and they ran before dawn to the foot of Sidling Hill Mountain to the west of the Great Cove and made camp. This location was roughly 10 miles by road from McConnell's Tavern. Now, where I'm at right now today is on top of Sidling Hill Mountain at a scenic overlook. Now, if you look out across here, this valley, this entire valley, is called the Great Cove at the time. Now, it's pretty much Fulton County, Pennsylvania. McConnellsburg, or where McConnell's Tavern would have been, is on the other side of that hill, right over there. Okay, not the big mountain, but the little hill, that's Scrub Ridge. McConnellsburg is nestled between Scrub Ridge and the Tuscarora Mountain, which is over there. On the other side of the Tuscarora Mountain is Squire Smithstown. So the pack train on the 5th would have crossed the bigger mountain over there, came to McConnell's Tavern to rest, and then the day of March 6, 1765 is when they set off down the trails to come here. Now, of course, James Smith was ahead of them with the idea of stopping the pack train. He went to the foot of Sidling Hill and set up an ambush. Most likely, we don't know for certain because history's lost it, but most likely James Smith set up his attack just down there at the foot of Sidling Hill where Route 30 today cuts through the mountain. That would be a good place for a strategic ambush. Again, we are unsure of exactly where it would have occurred, but that would have been a good idea. So, on March the 6th, 1765, the pack horse train was crossing this valley, but James Smith and his 10 black boys were set up down here at the foot of Sidling Hill. Now, Smith's men dressed themselves as they did during Pontiac's war. They dressed in leggings and breechclout, as the Indians would do. They put their green shrouds on their shoulders and red bandanas on their heads, and they painted their faces black with charcoal to dress as these rangers did before. James Smith's black boys waited in ambush along the road in preparation for the arrival of the pack train. As Allison's pack horse train reached the foot of Sidling Hill, which again would be down in there somewhere, it was being led by a driver named John Sampson. The forest would have been very quiet and very calm. As the pack horse train approached, James Smith ordered his men to scatter about 220 yards along the side of the road, and for his black boys to hide behind a tree in teams of 2, about 50 yards apart. They were ordered not to fire their rifles until the man who shared a tree with them had loaded his gun first, a tactic used by native warriors. James Smith and his black boys set an ambush and waited. As John Sampson led the long 81-horse train about 1 in the afternoon on March 6, 1765, the forest down there erupted with rifle fire, which was followed by war whoops and cries of victory. Allison, at the end of the pack train, was startled at the distant noise, fearing that the locals were attacking his pack train. Now, at the front of the pack horse train, John Sampson was confronted with constant slow rifle fire coming from the trees along the road as the black boys shot at the pack horses. Horses were falling all around him as they were struck by rifle balls. A driver, who was possibly Sampson, we're not exactly sure, called out to his attackers and asked what they wanted. The response from the black boys was to unload the goods in 15 minutes and place them in one place, or the armed locals would shoot the rest of the horses and the pack horsemen. As Sampson and his drivers unloaded the pack horses, the black boys ran around the hills and yelped and shot their rifles in the air in celebration, much like the natives would do. Smith allowed for Sampson and his men to take their private property in return from which they came. After unloading, John Sampson ran from the front of the train with unloaded horses, yelling and screaming that the front of the train was under attack. Allison, who had very little choice, retreated after seeing at least 2 horses shot and bundles of the goods cut open. When James Smith and his 10 black boys opened up the cargo, they discovered items of war that could be used against the settlers on the frontier. Among the cargo was blankets, shirts, red war paint, lead, beads, wampum, tomahawks, and scalping knives. What James Smith didn't find was what they were looking for, which was the rumored gunpowder. James Smith then ordered for the goods to be burned, except for several large barrels of rum. Smith did not want himself nor his black boys to be accused of stealing. They were not common thieves. They just didn't want the goods to exist. As Allison retreated back to the Conococheague settlement, back across this valley and up over those hills over there, okay, with empty pack horse saddles and several horses short, a large inferno down here at the foot of Sidelong Hill clouded the March afternoon skies with dark clouds as Croghan's very important and very lucrative cargo went up in smoke. The evening of March 6, 1765 was a profound one for Lieutenant Grant and Black Watch here at Fort Loudoun. What was left of Croghan's pack horse train arrived at the fort, led by Robert Allison and with Robert Callender at the rear. And they would have most likely went through these gates right here. After Allison explained the situation, Callender was furious at the behavior of the local people. He complained to Lieutenant Grant that their actions were an insult to the crown of England and that the king's goods was destroyed unlawfully. Callender demanded for Grant to provide an armed guard to retrieve what remained of the cargo and arrest the local men who committed such a horrible crime. At this request, Grant ordered his sergeant, who was Sergeant Leonard McGlasson, and a squad of men to go search the area for the cargo, recover it, and capture anyone who is suspected along the way. Callender at this point offered money as compensation to the soldiers, as he said he would offer them a reward of £10 for every person they captured that proved to be involved with the destruction of the goods. Charles Grant had misgivings about this offer of Callender's, for he and his men were British soldiers, and not to take money for their services. But Grant did nothing to stop Callender. By 9 o'clock that night, Sergeant McGlasson and his 12-man squad was ready to depart. Sergeant McGlasson's squad consisted of himself, Corporal Duncan Cameron, John McGill, George Sutherland, Enos McKay, Donald McKay, John Corbett, John Durr, John Crookshanks, Lakeland McGillen, and John MacDonald Sr. and John MacDonald Jr., all Scottish Highlanders of Black Watch. Along with this squad was Robert Allison and possibly a few pack horse drivers and their horses who could direct the sergeant to the site of the attack. About midnight, McGlasson and his squad proceeded through Larrabee's Gap with the help of a nearly full moon. With the extra light, the sergeant spied 7 men in the woods who suddenly ran off after spotting the Highlanders approaching their position in the gap. Sergeant McGlasson yelled out several times for them to halt, but the men did not stop. This confrontation would have occurred somewhere near where I am at today, which is Buchanan's Birthplace State Park, or on up the mountain, which is Buchanan State Forest. In that area had been about where this confrontation would have occurred. The sergeant saw, with the help of the bright moon, that these men had new blankets wrapped around them to insulate them from the cold night air. McGlasson felt that because they all seemed to be in possession of new blankets, and they were in the woods in the middle of the night, and they were running away from his squad, that these men most likely were members of the scoundrels who attacked the pack train. So McGlasson ordered a pursuit. About halfway up the Tuscarora Mountain, McGlasson confronted a man with 2 rifles, who McGlasson personally made prisoner and confiscated the man's rifles. Another man was captured by the rest of the Highlander squad. These 2 men were kept guarded by Corporal Cameron and 4 other men in the rear of McGlasson. And this was as McGlasson and his remaining soldiers continued to the top of the mountain. As McGlasson and his 6 men reached the top of the mountain, Corporal Cameron cried out to them that more men were creeping in the woods close to the rear position that the corporal held, which would have been somewhere in this vicinity or maybe a little higher up the mountain. McGlasson wheeled his men around to turn back and give chase to these men that were hiding in the woods. McGlasson gave strict orders not to fire at these men, but while they gave chase, 2 Highlanders fired their guns at the fleeing men anyhow, but the bullets missed their marks. Sergeant McGlasson, his corporal, 10 soldiers, Robert Allison, and some drivers, and 2 prisoners crossed the Tuscarora Mountains and entered the Great Cove to arrive at McConnell's Tavern, which is McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania today, and behind me is the tavern. At the public tavern, McGlasson made inquiries and examined everyone here at the public house, but in the wee hours of March 7, 1765, he could find no evidence that any of the patrons of McConnell's Tavern were involved in burning of the trade goods and assaulting Callender's pack train. McGlasson left his corporal and 4 men and the 2 prisoners at the tavern and continued west to the site of the attack, a full 20 miles from Fort Loudoun. After arriving at the site of the attack at about 6 a.m., which most likely would have been, again, somewhere down there, the party found 18 loads of rum untouched, 2 loads of dry goods, and 2 loads of lead. All the rest were burnt to ashes. According to Allison's testimony on his discovery, 59 pack horse loads were lost in the attack. According to Grant's testimony, 3 horses were killed and 3 more were wounded in the attack by the Black Boys. No man was harmed by the Black Boys. The rum and the surviving goods and lead were gathered up by the party and carried over the mountain across this valley and back to Fort Loudoun. McGlasson, his men, Allison, the drivers, and the remaining cargo came back to McConnell's tavern and rejoined the corporal, the 4 other men, and the 2 prisoners, and headed back over the mountain through Larrabee's Gap to return to Fort Loudoun. As McGlasson and his squad were negotiating the rugged mountain terrain of the Tuscarora Mountains, Grant was writing a letter to Lieutenant Nathan McCullough, commander of Fort Bedford, which sat further west on the road to Fort Pitt. Lieutenant McCullough forwarded Grant's info in a letter to Fort Pitt, addressed to George Croghan. Now, Croghan sat in Fort Pitt, patiently waiting for his trade goods to arrive. Croghan had to have a smile on his face because once the goods were received and trade was reopened, his scheme would personally earn him 2,470 pounds of British currency at a time when the average property owner in Pennsylvania only had 186 pounds to his name. That smile would disappear when Croghan received McCullough's letter that read, "This day, a soldier of the 42nd Regiment from Fort Loudoun informs me that the goods for you to be served out to Indians were burned and destroyed, except a few kegs, by a set of villains that attacked the drivers 12 miles this side of Fort Loudoun. Those villains disguised by having their faces blacked. 4 of your horses were killed. The rest were allowed with the drivers to return to Fort Loudoun. Mr. Grant further informs me of his being told that there were upwards of 100 Virginians to waylay them between Loudoun and this post. This by far exceeds the Paxton affair. The consequence may be bad in hindering your going down the river in proper season." Obviously, James Smith successfully made 10 men seem like 100, and the Virginian ruse worked. Allison and his men, most likely with horses carrying what was left of the cargo, crossed the mountain first and was met by 20 armed men. These men told Allison that they intended to rescue the 2 prisoners that McGlasson captured the night before. Now, following behind Allison was McGlasson and his Highlanders, where his corporal was bringing up the rear with the 2 prisoners. On the east side of the mountain, near where McGlasson personally took a prisoner and 2 rifles the night before, which again would be somewhere around here near Buchanan's birthplace state park or state forest, the Highlanders found a scalping knife. Suddenly, 4 frontiersmen with guns approached McGlasson and his party on the mountain. One of these frontiersmen asked McGlasson where he had been. McGlasson responded, "In the Great Cove." "What business brought you there?" asked the frontiersman. "The King's service," answered the sergeant. "Did you take any prisoners?" asked the local. "2 of them," was the response. "What were they taken prisoner for? What was the crime?" came the next question. "Well, for destroying the King's goods," the sergeant would have said sternly. "Well, Sergeant, where will you be taking them?" "Fort Loudoun," said the gruff Highlander. Well, this would have agitated the frontiersman. "You shall not bring these prisoners to Loudoun until we know for what charge." Sergeant McGlasson would have scoffed at this and said, "Well, as it seems you are determined to rescue these prisoners, I should make you prisoner as well." The sergeant advanced and captured the man, while the other 3 retreated from the location. Now, as McGlasson's party further descended the mountain at Larrabee's Gap, they were stopped by about 50 frontiersmen, all with guns and their thumbs on their locks, ready to fire upon the Highlanders. One of the frontiersmen yelled out, "Sergeant McGlasson, I will shoot you through the heart." The 12 Highlanders were clearly outnumbered by these 50 frontiersmen. Guns were pointed in both directions and tensions were obviously high. When McGlasson walked up to the line of frontiersmen and guns and faced the man that threatened him, and he faced the man's gun barrel. The proud, loyal Highlander sergeant was there for king and country. He was there in service of the Empire. He felt he had every right. Sergeant McGlasson reached up and ripped the gun out of the man's hand and seized him as a prisoner. McGlasson yelled his orders to his 11 Highlanders, "Disarm and make prisoners of as many of them as you can." And the Highlanders fell upon the frontier people, capturing 3 more prisoners. As McGlasson's party advanced down the mountain and down the road to Fort Loudoun, this party of frontiersmen regrouped in front of them and blocked the road. McGlasson yelled out, "Where are you going?" And the answer was, "Hunting." "If you are hunting us," explained the sergeant, "you should find us better game." McGlasson paused and then yelled out, "Clear the road for the king's troops." The frontiersmen stood their ground in front of the Highlanders, determined to stop them from taking their 6 prisoners and 7 rifles to Fort Loudoun, which to the opinions of the frontier inhabitants was obviously illegal. The British military had no right to take prisoners or personal property without a warrant from local judges. McGlasson then yelled out an order to his outnumbered squad, "Fix bayonets." McGlasson planned to charge the larger group of frontiersmen. Pretty ballsy move. Knowing that they did not want to start a shooting match with the British troops, the frontiersmen cleared the road and McGlasson made it back to Fort Loudoun after losing a night of sleep and marching 40 miles distance. Here at the fort, Callender greeted McGlasson and his squad with open arms, and because of those soldiers risking their lives, suffering fatigue, and having rescued some of Croghan's goods that Callender was in charge of, Callender openly gave some money to these soldiers in compensation. An action looked as bribery of a public official by the locals of the Conococheague settlement. As McGlasson was on his way back to Fort Loudoun with his prisoners, Callender was busy trying to take his own prisoners. On March 7th, 1765, Callender, Elias Davison, James Fleming, and Justice James Maxwell rode to Reese Porter's house, a man seen multiple times in groups trying to stop the packhorse trains, and to the traders, most likely a member of the Black Boys. Even though Justice Maxwell rode with these men, Callender, Davison, and Fleming entered Porter's home without an official warrant and tied up Reese Porter and rummaged around his house. Porter was taken back here to Fort Loudoun as the 7th prisoner, along with 2 bars of lead that Callender believed was from the trade goods that were on the pack train. At this point, Callender and Grant had 7 prisoners, 5 rifles, and 4 smoothbore guns held here inside Fort Loudoun. Now, most likely, the prisoners were held in the guardhouse. This is the modern representation of the guardhouse, and I will take you inside to look at the jail inside. So this is the inside of the guardhouse here at modern Fort Loudoun. They have been doing great work here, rebuilding this fort the way it would have looked at the time of the Black Boys and during the French and Indian War. This is inside the guardhouse. Here is a jail cell, and inside this jail cell would have been most likely where most of the prisoners would have been held. While at Fort Loudoun the next day, Justice James Maxwell, who clearly was backing up his friend Callender in this dispute, received word from friends that a group of armed men were lurking around the fort with the intent of rescuing Reese Porter and the other prisoners, and planned to take Maxwell and Callender's lives. Even though the prisoners were seized without a warrant and without the greatest probable cause, the standard procedure was to serve the prisoners up to the local judges and deliver them to the jail at the county seat at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The civil law of England demanded it. But Grant and Callender decided not to deliver the prisoners to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, because with the frontier people prowling around this fort, it was unsafe for them to move the prisoners for fear of an attack. They also felt that putting these prisoners in the jail at Carlisle would make it easier for the locals to break them out, thinking that Fort Loudoun here was more secure than the locally run Carlisle jail. Out of fear of an attack on the fort, Grant ordered his men to be under arms the night of March 8th. On March 9th, 1765, Grant and his Highlanders, which numbered less than 50 soldiers here at the fort, were on high alert, prepared for a siege. Suddenly, around 200 armed people crept out of the trees and into the fields that surrounded Fort Loudoun. Grant looked out as the frontier people surrounded the fort and outnumbered him 4-1. The capture of the prisoners and of the guns were now a bigger issue than the trade goods. These people were local settlers, not members of the black boys that attacked the pack trains. This was way bigger than that now. Knowing that this could turn into a civil war if he used force like his sergeant did just days before, Grant decided it would be better to negotiate. Grant asked to speak to the leader of the people surrounding his fort, and a man stepped forward, and it was none other than James Smith. But this time, he was dressed as a frontiersman, and without his black face paint. In fact, no one in the frontier people's force disguised themselves to surround the fort at this time. Smith entered the fort for negotiating purposes when Grant asked, "What do you mean by appearing with such a mob before the king's fort?" "We have come to demand the prisoners," said James Smith. "It is our understanding that they are to be committed to Carlisle jail." "Mr. Smith, what would you do if I were to send these prisoners to Carlisle under armed escort by the king's troops?" asked Grant. "Then we shall first fire over the soldiers as a warning," replied James Smith. "But if they would not give up the prisoners upon that, we are determined to fight the troops and die to a man sooner than let them prisoners go to Carlisle." Grant wanted to avoid a civil war. He was unprepared to go to war with other British citizens. He was outgunned and he was outnumbered. Plus, the people that surrounded his fort were not people involved with the trade goods dispute. These people were just common citizens that had a problem with the British military. Grant decided to release the prisoners on bail. But what Grant did not release was the 9 guns that he held, private property, that the local frontier people viewed as being seized illegally. One of the #1 complaints of the frontiersmen and the black boys was that the illegal trade goods in Callender's pack trains and Croghan's cargo contained gunpowder, an obvious item that could be used for war. Unfortunately, the black boys found no gunpowder in the cargo that they burnt at Sidling Hill. So where was this mysterious gunpowder? Information buzzed throughout the Conococheague settlement on where the gunpowder could be. On March 9th, 1765, a physician named Richard Browson was here at William Maxwell's house, which was located here along Montgomery Church Road between Greencastle and Mercersburg, Pennsylvania today. A knock came to the door, in which Dr. Browson answered to see about 20 men whose faces were painted black and were disguised standing at the door. These men asked for the master of the house, but Browson said that Mr. William Maxwell was not at home. The black boys were communicating between themselves in German and had German accents. That's when they asked in English where Croghan's store of powder and lead was at. Dr. Browson had no answer for them, being a bystander, so the black boys broke into the storehouse. that stood near Maxwell's home, which is somewhere in this vicinity behind me here, and searched the goods stored there. They found 8 barrels of gunpowder, and in celebration whooped and yelled and fired their pistols in the air. This signal was then answered by whoops and shots from 20 other men in the distance, who came up to the rest and helped move the gunpowder into the woods, since each barrel weighed about 80 pounds each. The black boys set fire to the powder barrels, in which the barrels exploded and burnt. After the black boys left, Justice James Maxwell arrived at his father's house here to be told this story by the terrified Dr. Browson, whose only evidence of identification of his abusers was that they spoke German. And because most people in this area were not German, he assumed they were from Maryland, or around what is now the Williamsport, Maryland area, which was heavily populated at the time by Germans. And this area was more Scotch-Irish, where the Germans were more down that way. In fact, Robert Callender had stored gunpowder and lead at Paulings, but moved them to various locations, such as 6 horse loads, which included 2 gunpowder barrels at Robert McFarland's house, which was somewhere close to what is now McFarland Road, just east of modern-day Mercersburg, Pennsylvania today. And he stored 30 horse loads, including 8 barrels of gunpowder and 4 or 5 loads of lead here at William Maxwell's. All of these goods, plus any still at Pauling's Tavern, was moved to Fort Loudoun for safekeeping until they could be moved to Fort Pitt. This event at Maxwell's, here on Montgomery Church Road today, is significant because it shows that at this time the black boys were no longer just a ranger group James Smith trained in Indian warfare. It became a movement. These men at Maxwell's were from a German background and was later proven to be from Williamsport, Maryland area. They were not part of James Smith's small commando group. They were part of a larger group of concerned citizens who acted against the traitors and later against the British soldiers for what they felt was for the common good. The black painted faces of the black boys from March 9th on became a symbol as well as a disguise. Croghan was furious. The French of New Orleans had sent trade goods up the Mississippi and into the West to trade with the Indians. Meanwhile, Croghan had his goods waylaid to the point that he had no idea when he may begin his journey downriver to the same Indians. To Croghan, he was not only losing the Indians once again to the hands of the French, he was losing money from his own pocket. On March the 12th, 1765, Croghan wrote to Bouquet and General Thomas Gage expressing his frustrations at the insolence in the people of Cumberland County, which was causing him a great uneasiness since the loss of the Crown's presence at Sidling Hill. He wrote to Gage that he had no doubt that Gage would find out the perpetrators of such a breach of the laws and have them punished agreeable to their crimes. To Bouquet, Croghan says, such a horrid crime should never be forgiven them, or there must be an end to civil and military power. General Gage was starting to regret giving Croghan this job. As the British commander sat behind his desk in New York City, Gage began to get letters asking for restitution. Brayton, Wharton, and Morgan asked for the Crown to pay for their goods that were lost. Robert Callender was also looking for money to cover his losses. Gage, upon hearing of the amount of goods being carried through the Conococheague settlement, was confused because he only gave Croghan 2,000 pounds of British funds for the public use, but yet 20,000 pounds of cargo was being transported by Callender, and upwards of 5,000 pounds of it was burnt to ash. General Gage wrote to Henry Bouquet that many pretenses will be made and stories told to conceal the truth, but it appears pretty plain that tricks of this kind were intended amongst them all, for Croghan had else no business that I can see to assemble any great number of Indians at Fort Pitt for his journey to the Illinois. This clearly shows that Gage was under the impression that it was quite possible Croghan was using his entire plan of peace with the Indians as a plan to just get rich quick, utilizing the protection of the British Crown. Gage later wrote that he doubted such a large quantity of goods could belong to any other but traders, and these traders were sneaking them to Fort Pitt under a military pass to violate Pennsylvania laws of no trade with the Indians. Gage was later convinced that Croghan's peace plan was legit, and he was relieved to find out that the Black Boys only destroyed a few £1,000s worth of cargo. But that did not stop Gage from scolding Croghan in a letter dated on April the 4th, 1765, in which he says, "If you had only minded the business you were employed in, followed your instructions, and made use of the permit given you by Colonel Bouquet for carrying up the goods to Fort Pitt, without taking upon you to encourage traders to act contrary to the law of the province, you would not have been involved in any difficulties on this account. The government of Pennsylvania, know when it is proper, will issue proclamations to that effect, and when that happens, there will be no danger of any want of goods at Fort Pitt." Governor John Penn sat in Philadelphia, faced with yet another problem since he became governor in 1763. First, it was Pontiac's War. Then it was the Paxton Boys incident that resulted in his city of Philadelphia being threatened by armed men from the frontier. Now, it's the Black Boys and the people of Cumberland County. Everyone was writing him letters, and he decided that he had to go to the frontier to sort all this mess out. In late March of 1765, Governor Penn arrived at the Cumberland County seat of Carlisle, and everything was in pandemonium. Traders wanted retribution, the local government was confused on what side to support, and local frontier people wanted protection. Once at Carlisle, the frontier people of Cumberland County, which contained the Pennsylvania part of the Conococheague settlement, gave Governor Penn a petition that expressed their sorrowful view. The petition said, "Permit us, Honorable Sir, to express to you on this occasion the alarming apprehensions which we have of being again involved in another war, from the unseizable supplies of clothing and warlike stores which we understand are preparing in great abundance, and amongst them a large quantity of ammunition, powder, lead, and scalping knives being already in our country, and destined for the savage, faithless, and unrelenting enemy, cannot but raise in our breasts the horrible images of murdered families, captivated brethren and friends, men, women, and children, exposed to all the cruelties and miseries which their savage dispositions can prompt them to inflict. Our houses and farms involved in flames. But alas, what does it avail us that the French are removed out of our country, that they can no longer excite and assist the Indians to ravage our settlements and murder our friends, if our own fellow subjects, regardless of His Majesty's or his officers' proclamations, nay, of all the laws of God and man, are still continuing to supply them with the means of our destruction? Have we, with the broken remains of our dismembered families, escaped the unheard-of cruelties of 2 Indian wars, only to be involved in a third? But those very persons who have hitherto sufficiently testified the want of humanity and compassion for our distresses, do they so eagerly thirst for our blood that nothing will satisfy them but the utter destruction of our whole families? Or are they so bent upon enriching themselves by an Indian trade that they will do it at the expense of so much blood and treasure as it must cost the crown in the colonies? Permit us, Honorable Sir, to implore your protection against the attempts of our fellow subjects, who, being remote from danger, sit at ease and know not what we feel, and to beseech you to interpose your authority to stop those goods from going to the enemy until peace be finally concluded, and to find out and bring to punishment the persons concerned in this unlawful commerce with our enemies, which has already influenced a number of people who have suffered greatly from the incursions of the savages, to assemble in a tumultuous and lawless manner to destroy some of the goods." The frontier people understood that the actions of the Black Boys were unlawful, but they say quite clearly that their hands were tied. It was either act in a lawless manner or risk arming the enemy that killed so many of their family members beforehand in previous wars. So they implored Governor Penn to arrest the traitors that broke the Pennsylvania law. Instead, Governor Penn, per the wants of the traders, the merchants, and the British military, pursued the black boys and the people of the Conococheague settlement. So right now I'm in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and behind me is the Cumberland County Jail. Now, this was built in the 1850s. It looks like a castle. It's actually a reconstruction or a mimic of a castle in England, Carlisle, England. But they built it in the 1850s. But originally, they said here in 1754 they built the original Carlisle Jail, which was some sort of stone structure, and that Carlisle Jail would have sat here at the corner of Bedford Street and High Street here in Carlisle, and that was where these prisoners that were originally taken at Fort Loudoun by the Highlanders, they were thinking about bringing them up here, but they never did. For over a week, Governor John Penn and his advisors worked in Carlisle to take sworn depositions and meet with justices and traders. Governor Penn understood that the people involved were upset about the British military overstepping their mandate by arresting men without considering civil law and the civil rights of the men taken prisoner. So, Penn decided to do it by the book and commission a grand jury, per the law. Now, Penn issued warrants for arrests of men, Colander, and other traders identified as black boys who were most likely present at the attack on the pack trains. The sheriff of Cumberland County was sent to the Conococheague settlement in the Great Cove to arrest these men and bring them here to Carlisle Jail, that said right here at this very spot. But the sheriff was unsuccessful as the men he was after disappeared and hid from his authority, clearly tipped off by someone involved at the court prep here in Carlisle. Now, Penn gathered testimony of witnesses and built a case to present to this grand jury created from people from Cumberland County, per the English civil law. This was a jury of their own peers. Penn left Carlisle before the grand jury convened at the beginning of April, but he was paramount in building the case against the men identified as members of the Black Boys. Now, Justice William Smith was brought in as a witness, and he was scrutinized heavily for aiding the Black Boys. Justice Smith claimed no involvement and no knowledge of the identity of the perpetrators, which was, of course, highly unlikely. But he did put up a great defense of the frontier people, again bringing up concerns mentioned in their petition to Penn. He defended the actions of the people as the only way to enforce the laws of Pennsylvania and protect the frontier at that time. He also argued that civil law, being the local law governing the civil rights of British subjects, was ignored by the British soldiers at Fort Loudoun when they apprehended British subjects without proper warrants from a judge, captured private property without warrants, and held people prisoner in a military installation instead at a county jail and without a trial. He further argued that the military should have no jurisdiction where civil law supersedes. The jury, made of local men from Cumberland County that also suffered through the Indian Wars and obviously did not want to see their families attacked again, came back with their verdict. No sufficient testimony to convict a single person. The accused were acquitted. Penn's comment on the verdict was that every man in Cumberland County was a rioter at heart, and 10,000s of the king's troops could not bring one to trial. He also wrote General Gage that in a regular course of justice, I have done everything on this occasion that could be done consistent with the law. Penn also said that this acquittal would make the Black Boys more bold and audacious, because now they would view their actions as legal and warrantable. After the attack on the pack trains and the rescue of the captured men at Fort Loudoun in the beginning part of March of 1765, the local inhabitants of the Conococheague settlement began to take up the mantle of the Black Boys as they set up a guard along the roads in their settlement and ordered inspections of all goods going west that they suspected of being Indian trade goods. The idea was if the government wasn't going to enforce the Pennsylvania no trade policy, then the locals would take up the job. For several months, volunteers joined the Black Boys movement and stood guard on the roads to inspect the goods moving west. They would issue passes to these traders that passed their inspections so they would not be waylaid again by any other patrols. An example of one of these passes is one given to Mr. John Gibson on June 1st of 1765, which lists the items that he carried with a statement that said, "We, they subscribers, being chosen by John Gibson with the consent and approbation of William Smith, John Ranwells, and John Allison, Esquires, to inspect a quantity of liquors, dry goods, etc., which goods, etc., the said Gibson is about to carry to Fort Pitt. In proof whereof we have examined all the loads, including in the above invoice, and have found no warlike stores, or any article that in our opinion can be any disadvantage or enable the Indians to point their arms against the frontier inhabitants. Given under our hands this first day of June, 1765, signed Robert Smith and Francis Patterson." A pass dated May 15th, 1765 by James Smith said, "As the Sidling Hill volunteers have already inspected these goods, and as they are all private property, it is expected that none of these brave fellows will molest them upon the road, as there is no Indian supplies amongst them." Note that James Smith called the Black Boys the Sidling Hill Volunteers and the Brave Fellows. They not only targeted traders, but also military members as well along the road. A pass from May 20th, 1765, signed by Justice William Smith, said, "Permit the bearers, Alex McKinley and Lakeland McGillen, to pass unmolested to and from Antietam, they behaving themselves soberly and inoffensively as becomes loyal subjects, they being soldiers, carrying a letter to Daniel McKay, and as they say, is going to purchase 2 cows." This Black Boys movement spread along the frontier like wildfire, even moving outside the Conococheague settlement into Cumberland County to other frontier counties. Near Lancaster, a group called the Paxtonians, reminiscent of the Paxton Boys, stopped wagons at Harris's Ferry, modern-day Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area today, and inspected their goods that was going to the trading post at Shamokin. Justice William Smith became the legal authority of the Black Boys movement. His particular view of the law believed that the Crown and the British Empire gave the power to regulate the trade within a colony to its governor. Because the official representatives of the governor on the Pennsylvania frontier was the Justice of the Peace, the power to inspect trade goods rested on the authority of the local justices. Justice William Smith sided with the frontier people and allowed for the inspections to occur. Other justices agreed with this interpretation of the law and also supported the inspections. At the time when the British military and the British imperial government was trying to centralize power here in the colonies, the people on the frontier were arguing for it to be decentralized and left up to the local magistrates and colonial governments, agreeing that the civil law governing the civil rights of British subjects should prevail over the military and imperial rules. This patrolling and inspecting was working well until a pack train shipment of about 40 to 60 horses refused to be inspected, which resulted into more violence on the frontier. On May 5th, 1765, a pack horse train made up of 40 to 60 horses owned by Joseph Spears refused inspection by the Sidling Hill Volunteers and made it to the safety of Fort Loudoun. At Fort Loudoun, the pack horses were unloaded, and the unloaded horses were taken to pasture in the fields of Roland Harris's, which was located just a few miles from the fort. Now, Harris's would have been located along modern-day Route 75, just north of the modern-day town of Fort Loudoun, Pennsylvania, just inside the mouth of Path Valley. Now, where I'm standing at here is along Route 75, north of the modern-day town of Fort Loudoun. This entire area here on the right-hand side of the road, or the east side of the road, would be Roland Harris's property. It would have ran along here probably 100 acres or so. It would have been all relatively cleared fields. Right now there's a lot of growth. There's houses dotting the area and this big substation that I'm standing next to. But this whole area in here would have been Roland Harris's land. Now the next day, May the 6th, the pack horse drivers went to the fields to check on their horses, when 30 armed men with blackened faces approached them and asked whose horses were that. When they were told that they were Joseph Spear's, the black boys said that no one shall go to Fort Pitt, but who they admit. After some more agitational discussions, the black boys tied up the drivers and flogged them severely with a whip. They killed 5 horses, wounded 2 horses, and they lit all of the pack horse saddles on fire, along with the blankets for each of the pack horses, or each of the saddles. One driver escaped this madness and ran to Fort Loudoun to get help from the Highlanders garrisoned there, and he would have ran in that direction over there. Now, Lieutenant Charles Grant sent out once again a 12-man squad commanded by the now known notorious Sergeant Leonard McGlasson. The half of the men in this squad was in the squad previously. The men in this new squad was John McGill, George Sutherland, Agnes McKay, John Corbett, John McDonald Sr., and John McDonald Jr., Daniel Seward, Daniel McGray, David McKenzie, Hugh Monroe, and Archibald McMillan. The squad arrived here at Roland Harris's and found the aftermath of the attack. The black boys were gone, so McGlasson pressed Harris to be his guide and to help track down the rioters that initiated this attack. The Highlanders, led by Harris, traveled south that way towards what is known as the Widow Barr Farm. The Highlanders scanned the village and fields around Fort Loudoun to find the culprits that attacked Spears' men and pack horses. During this search, the members of Black Watch spotted an armed man who still had his face smudged with black charcoal, but looked like he tried hastily to rub off the black from his face in an attempt to cover up his membership to the Black Boys. He was quickly made a prisoner by the Highlanders. Meanwhile, Justice John Shelby was sitting at Cunningham's Tavern in Squire Smithstown and observed 20 men get up and leave the tavern with their faces blackened and head to the Widow Barr's farm to meet up with the other 30 black boys that was there after they flogged the pack horse drivers. The Highlanders reached the house of the Widow Barr, which the house is disputed on where it's at. Here is a house on the property of the Widow Barr, but chances are that that's probably not the house that they were actually held up into. It was a log structure of some sort and maybe set somewhere else around here. McGlasson's squad with their one prisoner stood outside the house in the open when a shot was heard from the woods at a distance. That woods could have possibly been over in there because that's a swampy area. Upon looking in the direction the gunshot came, McGlasson saw that the enemy was in the woods, and they were numbering, by his recollection, about 70 or 80 armed men. Now, McGlasson ordered the frontiersmen to stop, but when the black boys refused, a Highlander discharged his gun in the direction of his attackers. In response, the black boys fired several shots at the Highlanders from the woods. McGlasson gave the order to return fire as his squad retreated from the open field to the cover of inside the house at the Widow Barr's, the Widow Barr Farm. Now, somewhere in this battle, a black boy named James Brown was struck in the thigh by a British military bullet. McGlasson and the Black Watch squad retreated to the cover of the log house as the black boys kept up a constant barrage of bullets on the home. Now this gunfire lasted for about an hour when suddenly a country man came up on the house. He said he was a bystander that just happened to come upon the battle by chance, which McGlasson had his doubts. The countryman told McGlasson that the men in the woods shooting at the house told him to relay a message to the sergeant in charge of the house. That message was that the black boys wished for the Highlanders to release their prisoner they held, and if the prisoner was not released, the Highlanders would never make it back to Fort Loudoun. Now McGlasson was outnumbered once again and was low on ammo, so he agreed to the terms and released the prisoner. The black boys were true to their word, and McGlasson and his small 12-man squad returned to Fort Loudoun unharmed. After the battle at the Wood of Bars, Justice Shelby was still at Cunningham's Tavern when the countrymen returned from the battle. Shelby reports that Cunningham's Tavern was indeed a meeting place for these men, as they must have filled in Justice William Smith on what happened. In which Smith replied with, "It was a pity some man would not undertake to settle those Highlanders, for they would ruin the country." After the battle, Justice William Smith issued a warrant to arrest Sergeant Leonard McGlasson for wounding James Brown and sent it to the constable of Peters Township. The warrant said, "You are hereby commanded in His Majesty's name to apprehend him, the said McGlasson, and him, that said McGlasson, being so taken or delivered, you are to bring before me, or the next justice for said county, in order to answer to said complaint, and be further persecuted against, according to law." Lieutenant Grant refused to give up Sergeant McGlasson, thinking that the issuer of the warrant, which was Justice William Smith, to be forfeit of any rights as a magistrate because of his actions to assist the black boys, and fearing that the sergeant would not get a fair trial here in Carlisle by the people of Cumberland County, who obviously supported the black boy movement. On May 10, 1765, Lieutenant Grant was faced with another threat to his garrison at Fort Loudoun. 200 armed black boys, some with their faces painted black, surrounded and approached the fort's stockade. Now James Smith once again stood as the head of this body of armed men, but this time there was a slight change. James Smith was accompanied by 3 justices of the peace named William Smith, John Allison, and Justice Reynolds. They were going to be James Smith's legal authority. Now James Smith, William Smith, and Reynolds expressed their desire to be let inside the fort to inspect Joseph Spear's goods that were stored at the fort for the past 5 days. Justices Smith and Reynolds said that this would satisfy the armed men that currently surrounded Grant's fort. Now Grant replied, "Mr. Spear's goods are under my care, per the order by General Henry Bouquet, and I have orders from the general at this time to send for a magistrate and take an inventory of all the goods here." Note that Grant now refers to Bouquet as general, since he was promoted from colonel to a brigadier general at this time. Also note that Grant provides this offer as a compromise in the hopes for him to de-escalate the situation at hand. Grant continues, "But I cannot proceed upon letting one of the justices take inventory of these goods when there is such a body of armed rioters about the garrison. I would be obliged to call upon some of them next week for the purpose of inspecting the goods then." Justice William Smith responded with, "I am not subject to the general's orders. Therefore, if I do not get liberty to take an inventory of the goods at this time, I would not come again to do it." Justice Smith most likely assumed this was a ruse to buy for more time to move the goods before the justices could inspect them. Grant then showed Justice William Smith the orders he received from Brigadier General Bouquet permitting the goods to pass, and also produced the permit that Joseph Spear from the commanding officer at Fort Pitt that also permitted the carrying of the goods for the support of the king's troops at that fort. Now, according to Grant, James Smith said that the commanding officer's pass was no pass, and that no military officer's pass would do without a magistrate's pass also. This referring to the passes that the black boys were issuing along the roads after they inspected the goods moving to the west. Justice William Smith agreed with his brother-in-law and added that this was not the king's fort, and this was not the king's road, because Fort Loudoun here and Forbes Road were built by the province of Pennsylvania, not the British military. This is a true statement. Now, Justice Smith also added that 500 men would not escort up those goods without a magistrate pass. With these statements, William Smith and James Smith are proclaiming civil law takes higher priority than the rules of the military, where people like Gage and Grant felt that the empire, which was controlled by royal decrees and the British military, should be obeyed by the subjects. The two Smiths were making the argument that the British military was ruled by the subjects. It was the civilians that were to determine the policies of the empire, not the governing elite. These words from William and James Smith illustrate the revolutionary tone that the black boys were setting, a tone of uprising that favored the rights of British citizens that the British military seemed to ignore. Grant was undeterred and never allowed them to inspect the goods. In May 1765, Croghan was holding council with some 500 Indians at Fort Pitt to find peace. Croghan got them to renew their peace treaty they made with Bouquet the year before, and was able to secure delegates to travel with him to Illinois to make treaties with the Indians located there. The main complaint was the lack of gunpowder, lead, and rum being traded for furs like the Indians enjoyed before. The success of Croghan, the Indians' complaints, the British military, and the traders and merchants were all reasons pressing on Governor Penn to reopen trade with the Indians. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of the frontier continued to inspect goods traveling west through their settlements and issuing magistrate passes, granting non-warlike cargo passage through the area by the justices of Cumberland County. The black boys were becoming bolder as they began to assault members of the Highlanders on the road. At some point, they attacked Sergeant McGlasson, most likely to fulfill the warrant for his arrest. According to Charles Grant's testimony, McGlasson was attacked by James Smith and his men, taken prisoner, and they used him very ill, which means basically that they beat the hell out of him. But the bold and tough Sergeant McGlasson escaped this attack to return to Fort Loudoun. The details of this attack have been unfortunately lost to history, for it would have been a very interesting story. But the details of the next attack, however, by the black boys have not been lost to history. On May 28, 1765, Lieutenant Charles Grant was out on a ride with two other men. James Smith and his black boys, who had surveillance upon the road, received word of Grant being out and about, and they decided to set up an ambush along his route back to Fort Loudoun. About a mile from the fort, James Smith, Samuel Owing, John Peary, and two others jumped out at Grant and his party. None of these men had their faces blackened. They were plain old frontiersmen at that time. Now, Grant tried to escape on horseback, and he tried to by running through the party that was attacking him. As Grant's horse passed by his attackers, a black boy reached out and tried to grab his horse by the bridle, but Grant shook him off. Grant seemed to be safe when James Smith yelled out, "Shoot the bugger!" A shot rang out which startled Grant's horse, and it bolted into a thicket. The brush in the thicket pulled at Grant enough to throw him off of his horse and onto the ground. The black boys suddenly surrounded Grant and declared that he was now the king's prisoner. One of the men shouted, "Take the dirk off the rascal." Note that a dirk is a Scottish word for a long, straight-bladed dagger, which means that they disarmed Grant from his sword. Grant asked, "For what?" The reply was, "We will let you know that before you go home." "Well, where are you taking me?" asked Grant. "We are taking you before Justice Reynolds," was the answer. But Grant felt this may be the wrong justice. Well, wouldn't it be better to go before Justice Smith, being the most convenient? "Our orders are to bring you to Justice Reynolds," was the reply. James Smith and his 4 black boys walked their high-valued prisoner through the woods that night for 7 miles from Fort Loudoun. The black boys kept Grant prisoner all night without a shelter as they hid in the woods, possibly from the Highlanders who were most likely out looking for their missing commander. Meanwhile, word was received at Fort Pitt that Lieutenant Grant was missing and most likely was captured by the black boys, or he was killed in action. The commander of Fort Pitt sent out 2 officers and 45 soldiers, and they traveled east towards Fort Loudoun to help the Highlanders of Blackwatch to recover their missing commander. And if Grant was killed, these men were to retake Fort Loudoun and secure the region for the British Empire. While Grant was held captive in the woods with the black boys, his captors told him that unless he would give up the arms that he held inside Fort Loudoun, they would carry him away into the mountains and keep him there. They continued by saying, "In the meantime, the country would rise and take the fort by force of arms, and by the means they would have all the goods in the fort as well as their own arms." Grant replied by saying, "It is not in my power to give up the arms without orders from my commanding officer, and if you do what you are threatening, you will be dealt with as rebels." James Smith responded, "We are ready for rebellion as much as you are ready to oppose it. We all know what we are doing here. We know that our proceedings are contrary to the law, but we must do what we must." At this point, James Smith and his black boys convened a council among themselves in which they discussed several options, which one was to tie Grant to a tree in the wilderness and just leave him to die. But they decided on a more lenient way, and they actually decided to take Grant south and to the wilds of Carolina and drop him off in the middle of nowhere. They proceeded 8 more miles into the wilderness when Grant finally had no doubt that these men of the forest, who were familiar with Indian ways, were indeed going to take him to Carolina. So Grant asked, "What would you have me to do in this matter of the guns? I told you it was out of my power to deliver you your arms. I need permission from my commanding officer. I need General Gage's permission." "Would you give security to deliver up the arms or pay 40 pounds? asked the black boys. Grant considered his choices here. Sign an agreement to give up the arms and possibly have to pay 40 British pounds, or be stranded in the rough, wild country of Carolina. Well, Grant decided to sign the bond. James Smith and his men delivered Grant to Cunningham's Tavern in Squire Smithstown, which is where I'm standing at right now, where Grant signed a bond for 40 pounds, in which he promised to give up the 9 guns he had stored at Fort Loudoun within 5 weeks, or he would personally pay 40 pounds as a fine. Colonel John Reed of Fort Bedford traveled to Fort Loudoun to find out what happened to Lieutenant Grant. To his relief, the lieutenant was alive and well and returned to duty at his post. As Colonel Reed was returning to Fort Bedford, he ran into the 2 officers and 45 troops that were coming from Fort Pitt to help rescue Grant. After being informed that Grant was okay, the force turned around and returned back to Fort Pitt. A few days after Lieutenant Grant was released, he personally went to Justice William Smith's house to express his disgust at his affair, and that would have been here, at this location, here in modern-day Mercersburg. Upon arriving at William Smith's, James Smith and the other 4 men that captured him were present at the home when Grant arrived. Now, Grant told Justice Smith that these were the men that attacked and captured him, and gave him the details of his imprisonment. But according to Grant, Justice Smith took no notice of it. James Smith and Lieutenant Charles Grant were now personally at odds. James Smith wrote a letter to Lieutenant Grant on June 17, 1765, in which he discusses the dispute without directly addressing Grant, most likely out of spite. To Lieutenant Grant, Conococheague, June 17, 1765. Honored Sir, I was occasionally at Loudoun a few days ago and had the opportunity of speaking with Mr. Grant, who told me all the satisfaction Colonel Reed desired for taking him prisoner was that I should acknowledge my fault to Mr. Grant, which I refused to do, except Mr. Grant would also confess he had used the country ill. This he refused to do, and said he had done nothing but his duty. If Colonel Reed would only say it is the duty of an officer at Fort Loudoun repeatedly to send out Mr. Grant in a party to rid private quarrels in the country, I will confess my fault to the above-mentioned gentleman. I acknowledge my fault to Colonel Reed, begging pardon for the same. I don't accuse Mr. Grant with all the hostilities committed by McGlasson, for I have reason to believe McGlasson acted contrary to his orders, and concealed many of the actions from his commanding officer. I am, honored sir, your obedient, humble servant, James Smith. Lieutenant Grant refused to give up the 9 guns. He felt that the bond he signed was invalid due to the being under duress when he was forced to sign the agreement. Grant was still unsure what to do with the guns and truly wanted an answer from General Gage on the matter. He wrote General Gage in August, I should be glad of your Excellency's orders with regard to the arms taken from the rioters and now in the garrison. About this time, the actions of the Black Boys were so well known that the world was hearing about it. London was reporting on the subject, and Benjamin Franklin, who was visiting England at the time, was getting news from his home colony on the matter. Franklin, who was trying to build a case to the Crown to remove the Penn family from control of the province of Pennsylvania, decided to use the Black Boys movement as an example of Governor Penn's weakness. Ben Franklin wrote on June 8, 1765, the outrages committed by the frontier people are really amazing, but impunity for former riots have emboldened them. Rising in arms to destroy property, public and private, and insulting the king's troops and forts is going great lengths indeed. Such practices throw a disgrace over our whole country that can only be wiped off by exemplary punishment of the actors, which our weak government cannot or will not inflict. The action of the Black Boys became so legendary on the frontier, a Mr. George Campbell, an Irish gentleman who was educated in Dublin, Ireland, composed a song about their actions that most likely was sung right here at Cunningham's Tavern. The song was sung to the tune of the Black Joke.
Ye patriot souls who love to sing, what serves your country and your king in wealth, peace, and royal estates, in wealth, peace, and royal estates. Attention gives while I rehearse a modern fact and jingling verse, how party interest strove what it could to profit itself by public blood, but justly met its merited fate, but justly met its merited fate. Let all those Indian traitors claim their just reward and glorious fame for vow base and treacherous ends, for vow base and treacherous ends. To Paulings in the spring they sent much warlike stores with an intent to carry them to our barbarous foes, expecting that nobody dare oppose. A present to their Indian friends, a present to their Indian friends. Astonished at the wild design, frontier inhabitants combined with brave souls to stop their career, with brave souls to stop their career. Although some men apostatized, who first the grand attempt devised, the bold frontiers they bravely stood to act for their king and their country's good, in joint league and strangers to fear, in joint league and strangers to fear. On March the 5th in 65, their Indian presence did arrive in long pomp and cavalcade, near Siloam Hill, where in the skies some patriots did their train surprise, and quick as lightning tumbled their loads and kindled them bonfires in the woods, and mostly burnt their whole brigade, At Loudoun, where they heard the news, they scarcely knew which way to choose, for blind rage and discontent, At length some soldiers they sent out, with guys to conduct a rout, and seize some men that were traveling there, and hurry them into Loudoun, where they laid them fast in one consent, But men of revolution thought too much to see their neighbors caught for no crime but false surmise, Forthwith they joined a warlike band and marched to Loudoun out of hand, and kept the jailers prisoner there until our friends at large were without fraud or any disguise, Let mankind censure or commend this rash performance in the end, and both sides will find their account, 'Tis true no law can justify to burn their neighbor's proper time, but when the property is designed to serve the enemies of mankind, it's high treason in the amount,
After all that had happened on the frontier in regards to attacking pack trains, burning cargo, shooting horses, shooting civilians, shooting at British soldiers, whipping drivers, capturing and threatening lieutenants, illegally arresting people, and confiscating personal property without a warrant, what ended up really rallying up people was an advertisement. On May 29, 1765, Thomas Romberg, a Highlander at Fort Loudoun, who was out searching for the missing Lieutenant Grant, who was captured the day before, said he stumbled across an advertisement upon the public road. When he arrived back at the fort after Lieutenant Grant was returned, he told Grant of his find. Grant requested a copy, which Romberg testified that he made because the original was stained with dirt. Romberg destroyed the original copy of the advertisement and gave Grant a copy of it that was in his handwriting. Romberg's copy read the following: "These are to give notice to all our loyal volunteers, to those that has not yet enlisted. You are to come to our town, and come to our tavern, and fill your bellies with liquor, and your mouth with swearing, and you will have your pass. But if not, your back must whipped, and your mouth be gagged. You need not be discouraged at our last disappointment, for our justice did not get the goods in their hands as they expected, or we should all have a large bounty. But our justice has wrote to the governor, and everything clear on our side, and we will have Grant, the officer of Loudoun, whipped or hanged, and then we will have orders for the goods, so we need not stop. What we have our mind and will do, for the governor will pardon our crimes, and the clergy will give us absolution. And the country will stand by us, so we may do what we please, for we have law and government in our hands, and we have a large sum of money raised for our support. But we must take care that it will be spent in our town, for our justice gives us, and that have a mind to join us, free toleration for drinking, swearing, Sabbath breaking, and any outrage what we have a mind to do, to let those strangers know their place. It was first possess Blackstown, and we move it to Squire Smithstown, and now I think I have the right to call it, and will still remain till our pleasure, and we call it Hellstown, in Cumberland County, the 25th of May, 1765, Peters Township. Your scripture says that the devil is the father of lies, but I assure you, this is the plain truth what I say. God bless our brave, loyal volunteers, and success to our Hellstown." Clearly, the wording in this advertisement is written like a parody, and the need for advertisements in May of 1765 was not really needed, since it seemed everyone was on board with the actions of the Black Boys movement in this area, so it was pretty clear that this advertisement was a fake. The question was, who faked it? Was it the traders? The Highlanders? An extra flamboyant local? No one really knew. But Justice William Smith pursued Romberg, since the only hard copy of the advertisement was in Romberg's handwriting, which pointed to him creating a fake advertisement and using the story of finding it on the road and it being dirty to cover up the fact that it was in his handwriting. With William Smith's allegations towards Romberg, many suspected Romberg as the culprit. While the dispute over the advertisement was hitting the desks of so many people, Croghan's successes at Fort Pitt with an established peace with the Indians encouraged Governor Penn and his council to consider what to do with the No Trade Proclamation. Should Pennsylvania open trade to the Indians? The governor made his decision. Governor Penn, on considering the advances Croghan made with the Indians at Fort Pitt and a former peace treaty signed on May 8th, decided to issue a proclamation reversing his previous proclamation on no trade with the Indians. The new rules stated that from and after the 20th day of June instant, all intercourse and trade with the several nations and tribes of Indians in amity with the Crown of Great Britain and living under His Majesty's protection shall be free and open to all persons residing in this province who shall apply for and obtaining my license to carry on such trade under the provisions and restrictions mentioned in the said royal proclamation. And whereas sundry persons have at several times lately assembled themselves in armed bodies on the western frontiers of this province, and have in a most riotous and illegal manner presumed to interrupt the passage of all kinds of goods to Fort Pitt, by which the garrison there has been greatly distressed, and that small parties are now encamped and lying in wait for the same purpose on the road of communication to that post. I do hereby strictly charge and command all persons whatsoever so assembled forthwith to disperse themselves and desist from all such illegal proceedings and practices. I do further enjoin and require all magistrates, sheriffs, and other officers to use their utmost endeavors at all times to quell and suppress all riots, tumults, and disorderly proceedings tending to disrupt the peace and quiet His Majesty's subjects, and also to be aiding and assisting in discovering and apprehending all persons that may be in any manner concerned therein, that the offenders may be persecuted according to due course of law. Given under my hand in the great seal of the said province at Philadelphia, the 4th day of June, in the 5th year of His Majesty's reign, and in the year of our Lord 1765, John Penn, God save the King. Trade was now open to the Indians, which no longer gave the Black Boys and the inhabitants of the frontier a legal reason to maintain their patrols of the roads. But for some time after this proclamation took effect, the Black Boys still waylaid and inspected pack trains for illegal trade goods. Even though the locals of the time and historians truly believed the advertisement to be faked, the governing officials of Pennsylvania and the British military at the time did not take it lightly. General Thomas Gage was furious. He forwarded a copy of the advertisement to Governor Penn, expressing urgency for Penn to do something. Gage wrote to Penn that it seemed that the inhabitants of Cumberland County were in an actual state of rebellion, and that they were supported by the justices. Penn called for his council to meet on the meeting, and upon some discussion, it was decided Penn would write to the justices of Cumberland County and demand a full account of the behavior of the citizens by collecting affidavits and sworn testimony. He believed the advertisement may have been written by Justice William Smith, being it refers to his town as Hell's Town. So he wrote a special letter to Justice Smith dated June 27, 1765. Sir, I am to inform you that you have been lately charged with having encouraged and protected the rioters in Cumberland County in their illegal and disorderly proceedings, and that you have suffered your house to be made their place of rendezvous. This was complained of by Lieutenant Grant and Justice Maxwell to Lieutenant Colonel Reed. As it is necessary for your own honor and my satisfaction that you should clear up the matter if it can be done, I do require you to appear before me at Philadelphia on Tuesday, the 30th day of July next, to answer these new charges, on which occasion I have also required Justice Maxwell to be here. I am, sir, your most obedient humble servant, John Penn. Justice William Smith was summoned to argue his case before the governor, and he accepted with open arms. The justices' hands were forced to deliver testimony on the matters occurring in Cumberland County, and Justice William Smith needed to build his case. On July 18, 1765, the justices of Cumberland County met here at Fort Loudoun. Now, Lieutenant Grant refused to allow the party to enter the fort, since members of the party, which included Justice Smith, personally assaulted his fort, his men, and or his own person. Upon protest by Justice Smith, Justice Campbell of Shippensburg agreed to move the proceedings to a nearby house outside the fort, and that satisfied Grant. The proceedings focused on the creator of the advertisement and examining the actions of Justice James Maxwell, who was on the side of the Highlanders and traders, and the actions of Justice William Smith, who seemed to be on the side of the black boys. Fort Loudoun garrison member Thomas Romberg gave sworn testimony saying once again he found the advertisement on the road, copied it, and destroyed the original. That was the story he stuck with. Henry Prather made mention of some of the proceedings, but makes an interesting statement where he says that the justices sworn in certain individuals by making them swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and answer all such questions as should be asked. But other individuals, especially ones who agreed with Justice Smith's conduct in the affair, were only sworn to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, without mentioning the whole truth and answer to such questions as should be asked. This suggests that the justices may not have been completely fair. On July 30th, 1765, Justice William Smith meets Governor Penn along with Justice James Maxwell. Maxwell represented the traders' interests and Smith represented the locals' interests. The exact discussion of this meeting has been lost to history, but it appears that Smith won the case and convinced Governor Penn of their legality because William Smith returned as a justice of the county without losing his job, and the fact that Lieutenant Grant told Gage that he was greatly concerned to find that complaints should have been made against me to your excellency by Governor Penn. Grant was accused of taking high bribes from Callender for saving the goods. He was also accused of not acting on a warrant issued for the arrest of Sergeant McGlasson, which he was supposed to obey under civil law. He was also accused of obstructing the inquest into the advertisement by not allowing the justices to meet inside the fort. Grant was also lambasted for detaining the 9 guns he stored inside Fort Loudoun, which were private property, seized without a warrant, and still detained after a grand jury acquitted the owners of wrongdoing. General Thomas Gage, however, always took Grant's side in this dispute, saying he was blameless in the affair. The result of the meeting, whether a secret agreement was made or not, was good for all around, except for Lieutenant Grant and Black Watch at Fort Loudoun. Justice William Smith maintained his job. James Smith and the other black boys were not brought to trial or served jail time. In general, the patrols and inspections along the roads ceased, and peace was reached with the Indians in the west. Grant and his men were lambasted for their behavior by Governor Penn, but they were also not formally punished under the law. Neither were Colander, Croghan, or any other traitor for their behavior. Once Justice Smith returned from his successful trip to Philadelphia, he targeted Thomas Romberg with a warrant to get him to admit to being the author of the notorious advertisement that caused a lot of this mess. The sheriff of Cumberland County served the writ to Romberg, who immediately went to Smith to settle it with hopes of not being carted off to a Carlisle jail. Justice Smith said it could be settled if Romberg would tell Smith who offered the advertisement. Romberg still stuck with his story of finding it, which Smith said, "The law will condemn you, that you are the author." Justice Smith said he pitied Romberg for being so ignorant of the law. Romberg replied with, "All that they or you can do to me would be to hang me or send me out the country." "No," said Smith, "but it will cost you some money. Mr. Christie and Mr. McCormick, who were other fellows within the room at the time, which was either here at Smith's house, at this location, or at Cunningham's Tavern down the street, began to talk to each other, which prompted Justice Smith to say, 'Gentlemen, none of your whisperings upon this affair.'" Romberg wrote directly to General Gage, asking for protection from Justice William Smith, in hopes that the British military would protect him from the local lawmen. Croghan and what trade goods he had sailed on 2 boats on the Ohio River, just 25 miles south of modern-day Cincinnati, where his expedition was indeed going well. Croghan's party, while camped on the banks of the river on June 8, 1765, was attacked by 80 Kickapoo and Mocotan warriors at daybreak. These natives were previously allied with the French and distrust the English, in which Croghan was representing, of course. This resulted in killing or wounding the majority of Croghan's men, a lot of goods being stolen, and a lot of loss of equipment. Croghan received a tomahawk wound to the head. Now Croghan wrote, "I got the stroke of a hatchet on the head, but my skull being pretty thick, the hatchet would not enter. So you may see a thick skull is of service on some occasions." While recovering from his wound, Croghan was able to successfully negotiate a treaty with the tribes that attacked him to agree to the British occupation of Illinois, proving his skills at Indian relations. In July, Croghan negotiated with Chief Pontiac, and in August negotiated peace with all Indian tribes that were present at the meeting. Thanks to Croghan, Pontiac's war was officially over. Despite still facing charges for shipping illegal trade goods through Pennsylvania on a military pass, in March, Croghan visited General Gage in New York City in October. Croghan was a hero and now could not be touched. A skill that got Croghan out of so much trouble before and now worked once again. But there was still one final thing that had not been resolved, and that was the 9 guns that Grant still held at Fort Loudoun. Private property of the inhabitants of the Conococheague settlement, seized illegally by Grant's Highlanders. Everything seemed to be going well along the frontier in November 1765. Harvest was completed on the neighboring farms. The violence had been tamped down during the harvest season. Lieutenant Grant at Fort Loudoun here still had 9 guns in his possession that he really didn't want. He was waiting on orders from his superiors on what to do with them. At first, Grant was waiting on General Thomas Gage to give him permission to return the guns. But in early October, Gage told Grant to release the weapons to a local justice once he received written approval from Governor John Penn. Now, Grant was ready to turn over the weapons because he says he approached the justices, but they did not want them. But he still had no approval from John Penn, the governor. Note that Gage created a legal way out of this mess by creating an avenue for Grant to transfer the illegally seized guns from imperial military control to the arms of the civil and colonial law. And without Governor Penn's approval, the by-the-book Lieutenant Grant still maintained hold of the guns that he illegally held. To make matters worse, General Gage, the highest-ranking British military officer in North America, decided to shutter the doors of the small forts on the frontier. He was trying to save money while the British Empire tried to recover economically from the 7 Years' War. And he felt that these smaller forts were no longer needed since the established peace with the Western Indians. Now, Fort Loudoun was one of these forts. Lieutenant Charles Grant and Black Watch, stationed here at Fort Loudoun, were to be transferred to Fort Pitt in November of 1765. Because of the issues Grant faced in the past 8 months, the commander of Fort Pitt sent a detachment of 31 men to Fort Loudoun to escort Lieutenant Grant and the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot out of Fort Loudoun and out of the Cumberland Valley and west of Fort Pitt. Now, rumors spread among the people of the Conococheague settlement in Cumberland County that Grant and his men were going to Fort Pitt. But what are the guns? On November the 16th, 1765, as Grant prepared to leave Fort Loudoun, a man from the countryside approached the fort with news to bring the lieutenant. The man said that there were 3 parties of men waiting around the fort, ready to take Grant and McGlasson prisoner, as they heard that the garrison was going to march soon to Fort Pitt. About 7 p.m., the fort became surrounded by many armed men from the local population, and these men were led by James Smith. They fired their guns and hooted and whooped and hallooed throughout the night, just as the natives would behave, showing that the locals were using James Smith's tactics. They fired upon Fort Loudoun all night long. The next day, November 17th, more men showed up around the fort and set up camps. During the day, the firing slowed, but because of the increase in men, it was impossible for anyone to leave the fort, or for anyone to approach the fort to relieve it. Grant could not leave Fort Loudoun until the Black Boys would stop their siege. As day turned to night, the firing on the fort revved up as Grant was at his wits' end. The lieutenant was tired from a lack of sleep. He was low on ammunition, and he ordered his men to hold their fire until their attackers approached the fort and tried to open the gates. As balls lodged themselves into the stockade and the side of the buildings here inside the fort, the Highlanders laid prone, waiting for the door to be breached. In the distance, the dark was cut with burning bonfires as up to 100 to 200 men kept up a constant barrage of steady gunfire onto this fort. At daybreak, the shooting stopped. The attackers sent word to Grant that they wanted their guns back. Grant, who could not find a justice willing to take the guns and was still waiting on word from Governor Penn to relinquish them to the people, refused. At 10 a.m., the Black Boys began a constant fire again. Grant and his Highlanders took cover behind walls and under furniture to avoid getting hit. The sentries on the bastions could not stand upright and hid behind the walls of the fort. That's where I'm at now, one of the bastions that is on the recreated fort structure here. One of these sentries was shot at least 3 times, and so was able to retaliate with one shot at the Black Boys. This was the only shot that the British soldiers were able to get off at their attackers during this entire siege. At 1 p.m., the firing stopped to allow a delegation to approach the fort to negotiate terms. The delegation was led by Justice William McDowell from the mill turned fort during the French and Indian War. Justice McDowell, who was able to stay impartial during the Black Boys conflict, suggested for Lieutenant Grant to give up the guns to him. McDowell said, "Upon a receipt, the arms will remain in my house, which has been fortified from the last Indian War, until such time as the governor of Pennsylvania would give orders about them. The owners of these guns would be satisfied on whatever the governor thought proper to do with them." Being that the garrison and Grant was very tired and weary from the lack of sleep the last 2 nights, Grant agrees to McDowell's terms as long as McDowell met certain requirements. First, McDowell had to sign an agreement that he would hold the guns until Penn directed him otherwise. Second, McDowell had to have assurances that James Smith, the leader of the Black Boys, would not interrupt or insult any person or persons hereafter in regards to this case. This was agreed upon by James Smith, who signed a contract that bound him to pay £500, which was a lot of money then, if he would harass anyone about these guns again. Grant was ready to leave the Conagajig settlement and go to Fort Pitt at this point. Though Grant did not like the deal he took, it was the best he could do without knowing when he was receiving reinforcements to help break the siege that was affecting his garrison. Unfortunately for Grant, 2 hours after making this deal with McDowell and James Smith, reinforcements arrived in the form of the 31 men from Fort Pitt. Upon receiving the reinforcements, Grant contemplated taking the arms back again by force. But being that the men were fatigued, he had no particular orders to carry the guns to Fort Pitt, and he figured the guns were safe in the house of Justice McDowell, which was formerly known as Fort McDowell. Grant decided to pack up and evacuate Fort Loudoun. A few weeks after the siege and evacuation of Fort Loudoun, Governor Penn sent a letter to William Smith that expressed Penn's opinion on Grant's actions. Penn wrote that there was no reason that there should have been so much formality used in returning the guns to the owners after the general had given orders to his officers to deliver them. Penn also wrote that it was his honor's pleasure that they be forthwith returned to their respective owners. Justice McDowell, with Penn's permission, returned the guns to their owners, fulfilling his promise to Grant. On December 13, 1765, General Gage wrote a letter to Governor Penn where he said, "If any shadow of law or justice remains in Pennsylvania, I am confident that you will leave no method untried to bring these lawless villains to condign punishment." He also referred to these villains as scoundrels called Smith and his rebel clan. On January 10, 1766, Governor Penn's council advised him to strip William Smith of his title of justice and remove him from the magistracy, since he'd been very negligent of his duty of upholding the law and order of the county. On January the 15th, Penn did just that, and William Smith was removed from his job. The council also advised the Chief Justice to send a writ directed to the Sheriff of Cumberland for apprehending James Smith, one of the principals and ringleaders of the rioters in the said county. By February the 10th, the writ was issued, and the sheriff was on the hunt for James Smith. By March, Robert Collender expressed concern of mere rumors of the people of the Conagajig planning to attack pack horses again, because William Smith lost his job and they were trying to arrest James Smith. Brighton, Wharton, and Morgan expressed Collender's concerns to the governor, who then in turn expressed their concerns to General Gage. Penn requested from Gage the use of his troops if the governor deemed it necessary to utilize the imperial war machine of Great Britain to aid the province in quelling future riots. Gage agreed to lend aid. Whether these rumors Colander heard were true or not is lost to history, but we do know that the Black Boys did not attack more pack trains in 1766. In June 1766, James Smith went into the wilderness of Kentucky and Tennessee to explore the large body of rich land westward. This was most likely to leave the Conagajig settlement while the writ for his arrest was active. On this expedition, he went with Josiah Horton, Uriah Stone, William Baker, and a Mr. James Smith from Carlisle, along with an 18-year-old black slave who was owned by Horton. This was one of the first expeditions into this area by the Anglo-Saxon race. The lead up to the American Revolutionary War found two different Americas. One was in the cities on the seacoasts, where the rich merchants and traders were upset at England for imposing unfair taxes without the colonies having a say in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Then, the other America was the people here on the frontier and in the interior. They were upset when government, specifically the British Empire in the case of the Black Boys, violated their civil rights. Taxes on commodities and such did not affect the people here on the frontier, but civil rights violations did considerably. Two different reasons to be upset at the same thing. Though they considered themselves loyal British subjects and did things in the name of the king, such as taking Grant as the king's prisoner, or singing a song that uses lyrics such as "Ye patriot souls who love to sing, what serves your country and your king." It was events like the Black Boys affair that turned the majority of the frontier against Britain in the end. Justice William Smith, James Smith, and the Black Boys were supporting British law as it existed, but the entity that was meant to uphold those existing laws was what they were opposing. It was the system that they bucked, not the actual rules as they were written. Though the two Americas didn't particularly like the British Empire for different reasons, the frontier joined forces with their American brethren when the idea of independence cropped up in the 1770s. After the official beginning of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord, a call to arms was heard all around the 13 colonies. On May 4, 1775, representatives of Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, met in response to this call. About 3,000 men enlisted immediately to fight for independence. Only 4,300 Pennsylvanian men in total met this call, showing nearly 70% of the initial enlistments to fight in the Revolution came from Cumberland County along the Pennsylvania frontier. Now, if you look here, this is a statue. I'm actually in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania right now. This statue is to commemorate the homecoming of James and Benjamin Chambers. Now, Benjamin Chambers, the founder of Chambersburg, or Chamberstown as what it would have been called, Benjamin Chambers is the man on the far left here. He's the old man too old to fight in the Revolution, but previously was involved in militia efforts during the French and Indian War. His son, who had been a colonel at the end of the war, James Chambers, is on the far right, and then a 17-year-old grandson of Benjamin Chambers who shares his namesake, his name also being Benjamin Chambers. This is the homecoming of them coming home from the Revolutionary War. They served in Company A, Rifle Battalion, for Pennsylvania during the Revolutionary War. These are the men who signed up immediately in 1775 to fight for independence. And these men, including at the time, who was 11 years old at the time, Benjamin Chambers the younger, would have been at the Battle of Bunker Hill and involved in all kinds of battles on this side of the Revolutionary War. Now, on December the 16th, 1773, a group of Boston men called the Sons of Liberty met to board a ship in Boston Harbor and launched a protest that would be later called the Boston Tea Party. According to one of these men, George Hughes, I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet, which I and my associates denominated the tomahawk, with which, and a club, after having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street, after being thus disguised, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to the place of our destination. When it was reported that a bunch of men dressed as Indians and with their faces painted black attacked a ship in Boston Harbor and destroyed trade goods by throwing them overboard, General Thomas Gage had to be thinking, not again. The actions of the black boys were reported and heard all over the colonies and England itself in 1765, though there is no proof that the Sons of Liberty were imitating the black boys' behavior in their own protest 8 years later. It is interesting to note that the black boys' calling card was used successfully by the people of Boston. The black boys' main argument was in favor of civil law and civil rights of British subjects. When independence was declared and a new government for the new country of the United States of America was formed, these ideas were expressed and further cemented into law. The unreasonable search and seizure of personal belongings by Grant and his Highlanders was solved in the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, where warrants were required with probable cause to seize someone's property. The arrest of individuals done by the garrison at Fort Loudoun was addressed in the Fifth Amendment, where no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, and no one should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The overstep of the British military during the Black Boys affair was also addressed in the 10th Amendment, where it says that the powers not delegated to the central government would be delegated to the states and the people, meaning the local and state law would supersede the power of the larger government in these situations. What happened to the people involved with the Black Boy affair? Well, George Croghan moved to Fort Pitt, but continued to be a scoundrel. During the Revolution, he left his home at Fort Pitt and moved to Philadelphia due to Patriot souls believing he was a British loyalist. He tried to clear his name and get clear title to his lands in the West from the new American government. He was not successful, and he died poor and unannounced just outside Philadelphia in August of 1782. He was buried in St. Peter's Churchyard in Philadelphia. General Thomas Gage sent 700 British soldiers to Concord that kicked off the Revolutionary War. He was removed from his duties and spent most of the Revolution in England. He died in England on April the 2nd, 1787. Governor John Penn was removed from influence on his family's colony of Pennsylvania when the Pennsylvanian people rewrote the Constitution of the state in 1776. After the Revolution, Penn was paid £130,000 as compensation for the remaining land of Pennsylvania that he laid claim to, and allowed to live on an estate in Philadelphia. John Penn died in 1795 in Philadelphia, in the city created by his grandfather, William Penn. Colonel Henry Bouquet purchased land called Long Meadows, located near the Long Meadows Shopping Center near Hagerstown, Maryland today, with the plan to retire there after his military service. Bouquet would serve in Pensacola, Florida, and contract yellow fever, succumbing to the fever in September the 2nd, 1765. He never got to spend time at Long Meadows. Lieutenant Charles Grant remained in service to the British Crown and fought during the Revolutionary War. After being promoted to captain in 1784, he died in 1785 at the age of 44. The 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, or Black Watch, that was garrisoned here at Fort Loudoun, left America to be stationed in Ireland. When the American Revolution started, Black Watch was brought back to America to fight at Brandywine, Long Island, and Monmouth. It existed until 1881, when it was combined with another regiment to form the Royal Highland Regiment, or the Black Watch. The Black Watch has been a British military unit since 1748 and still continues to serve the Crown of Great Britain to this day. William Smith lost his title as Justice and never pursued to get it back. William Smith died on March the 27th, 1775. His estate here at Squire Smithstown was transferred to his son, who on March 17th, 1786, laid out the plan for the town and renamed it Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, after Revolutionary War hero and General Hugh Mercer. James Smith lived a long and adventurous life that was recorded in his 1799 autobiography. The events at and around Fort Loudoun only took up 5 pages of his 161-page autobiography. He went on to explore Tennessee and Kentucky, moved to western Pennsylvania, served on the Congress to rewrite Pennsylvania's Constitution, fight in the Revolution, move to Kentucky, and become a family man. During the Revolution in 1777, he and 36 of his men demonstrated the power of Indian warfare by harassing the British in New Jersey ahead of George Washington's forces. Smith's men took on 200 British soldiers and forced their retreat. In a few days, Smith's group took prisoner or killed over 35 British soldiers, showing how well his tactics worked in war. After this success, James Smith approached General Washington and suggested he raise a battalion of marksmen and dress them in Indian fashion and use the native guerrilla warfare techniques against the British. Washington, who wanted to fight a gentleman's war, did not like the idea of white men turning Indian and offered Smith a position as a major in an already existing marksman battalion. James Smith refused and went back on the frontier to combat Indians who were being paid by Britain to harass the frontier inhabitants. Though at the time the U.S. military did not embrace Smith's native tactics, today similar guerrilla warfare techniques are taught and used by our special forces and is one of the main land-based fighting styles used the most in modern warfare. In 1812, James Smith, at the age of 74 years of age, tried to enlist into the American Army to fight in the War of 1812 against the British and their Indian allies. He was denied, for he was too old, but he still traveled that year with an army of 2,000 men under the command of future President William Henry Harrison. Smith was proud to see that some of his Indian tactics being used by this army in combat and travel. James Smith passed away sometime in 1812 or 1813, and most likely around or somewhere in Kentucky. As I sit here in this beautiful reconstruction of the barracks of Fort Loudoun, which has been diligently made by the efforts of the Fort Loudoun Historical Society here at the fort site, I have to wonder and have to think, this whole Black Boys thing, was it a rebellion? Even though these events were called the Black Boy Rebellion throughout history, there is a debate if it was truly a rebellion. Some have gone so far to say that the Black Boy Rebellion was actually the beginning of the American Revolution. So, what was it? The American Revolution was definitely a revolution. The definition of revolution is a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. The Black Boy Rebellion was not a revolution. James Smith, William Smith, and the Black Boys did not want a new system. They wanted the British system that was already established, but was being ignored by the British military. They wanted the civil law to prevail where it should have, not the tyranny of the British military acting in force against them and in violation of their civil rights. You wouldn't blame them in their case. Just think about it. They lacked government money and help to defend their settlements from Indian attacks, but yet traders were arming those same enemies to attack them again. When they asked for the law to punish the traders, nothing is done. When the people act on this outrage to stop the traders, the government arrests them instead of the traders. Then the traders possibly get compensated by the very government that did nothing to protect the people in the frontier. No wonder they were upset. Yet still, they felt they were doing their duty for king and country. So they were not revolting against King George III yet. But these actions left a bad taste in the mouth of the colonists to later support revolting against the king 10 years later. The Black Boys' Rebellion was not the beginning of the American Revolution, but was the first shots fired at British troops by organized American colonists. An important historical significance that is often overlooked by historians and history books. But it may have been the beginning of a revolution if the dispute played out differently. Despite calls from General Gage, Colonel Bouquet, Lieutenant Grant, and others in the British military at the time, the British military did not send in a large number of redcoats to snuff out the light of the Black Boys. Neither did the Black Boys act in such a way to incite this response. Many times they had the opportunities to kill redcoats, but they refrained and showed a lot of restraint in their militant behavior. No man was killed in the Black Boy Rebellion. The British response to the Boston Tea Party in 1774 and 1775 was that of subjugation and a show of military force. If that same force was shown in response to the Black Boys' attacks on the pack train, a similar result of Lexington and Concord could have occurred to trigger a revolution here in modern South Central Pennsylvania. The question would be, would the people on the American seacoast go to support the frontier people in this scenario, as the frontier people came to support the people on the American seacoast in 1775? God only knows. If it wasn't for this bad taste put in the mouths of the frontier people during the Black Boys' Rebellion, America may not have had enough soldiers and riflemen to win the war against Great Britain. It was the tough people on the frontier that eventually won the American Revolution. The definition of rebellion is an act of violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. This also does not describe the Black Boy Rebellion well, because they really were not resisting the political government. They sided with the laws of Pennsylvania and the laws established by the British Parliament. What they did resist against was the imperial segment of the British government, which was governed by the British military. The Black Boys started out resisting illegal trading by criminals, but it ended up as a resistance against British imperialism. The segment of British government that violated their civil rights at Fort Loudoun through military force and allowed the traders responsible for shipping illegal cargo to get away with it. Along the coasts, Americans started out resisting taxes established by the British Parliament. That eventually led to the Boston Tea Party, which then resulted in Parliament passing laws to punish Americans for that protest. Because the uprising on the coast was more directed to the laws created by Parliament. Their actions were more of a rebellion than the Black Boys' actions, which was directed more to the imperial military arm of the government. But the Black Boys could still be considered a rebellion, just not one against the arm of government that makes the laws, but one against the government that was charged to uphold the laws. When 1775 rolled around, though, the distaste of the British military in the West and the distaste for British legislation on the coasts combined to create an ideology that supported revolution to forcefully overthrow all the arms of government and create a new system. This grew to become the United States of America. The Black Boy Rebellion was a lost piece of history that was significant in turning the people on the frontier against the rules of British military and eventually the British rulers. Though not the first shots of the American Revolution, it was a necessary precursor that expanded the hatred of imperial rule to the Western people of America, the very people who lived, fought, and trained for war. They were the tough people who became Washington's muscle in the form of the American Rifleman battalions. They were the people that stood up to native attackers paid off by the British, and after beating them back, turned to the coast and whipped the British to see them surrender at Yorktown in 1781. These men supported the creation of a government that would give civil law a high priority, where individual freedom was a God-given right, and it was the freedom that became the mainspring of human progress for the past 250 years. At the center of this pivotal change was the very people that opposed traitors and British soldiers in the Conococheague settlement in 1765. Neil Swanson's book, The First Rebel, expressed in a fanciful way the true story of James Smith and his Black Boys, but by doing so he helped to preserve history that was easily lost to time. It is a story so exciting and so out of the ordinary that you would think it was a work of fiction like Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, but in reality, it was true. The life and actions of James Smith was so surreal that even Smith himself recognized it when he wrote it in his 1799 biography. I was strongly urged to publish the following work, but I apprehended a great part of it would be viewed as fable or romance. No wonder they hired John Wayne to play him 140 years later. Thank you for viewing this long series of videos. It was a project and a long one at that, but there was no other way to tell this story. It could not be done in one 30-minute video. Thank you for sticking with me on this one. I would like to thank Dan Guzzi for his research he published in his book entitled The Black Boys Uprising of 1765, and Patrick Spiro for his research he published in his book entitled Frontier Rebels. If it wasn't for this research, this story would not be told. Please also check out my other sources and check out the 1939 movie Allegheny Uprising. Please, if you enjoyed this series, please like these videos and subscribe to the channel for more. And I will see you later.